The year was 1917, and the night smelled of rain and lilacs. From the balconies of Basin Street, the city of New Orleans exhaled its last sigh before midnight. Down below, gas lamps trembled in their glass cages, and across the street, the doors of Mahogany Hall were closing for the final time. Inside, a woman dressed in crimson silk stood motionless beneath a chandelier whose light had begun to dim. Her name was Lulu White. She had built an empire of pleasure and illusion, a palace for the senses where laughter and jazz drifted into the streets like perfume. Now she stood watching it end as if the walls themselves were taking their last breath. Good evening, my friends. Wherever you are listening from, an old room, a quiet porch, a sleepless city, tell me where time finds you tonight. Leave a trace, a word, a place. Subscribe and sit with me a while. We will walk together through a forgotten life, through shadows made of music and marble, and see what remains of a woman who once ruled the heart of New Orleans. The story begins far from the glowing streets of that southern city, in a quieter place where the land was red and the air heavy with the hum of cicadas. Part 1. The Quiet Fields of Alabama. There are some lives that begin not with a cry but with silence, a silence too deep, as though the world is holding its breath to see whether this soul will stay. Lulu's story may have begun in such silence somewhere near Selma, Alabama, around the year 1868, or perhaps earlier before the guns of the Civil War had cooled. No one can say for certain. Records were rare things for those born between worlds, neither fully claimed by one nor embraced by the other. She was said to be a quadroon, a word that now feels harsh upon the tongue, but then was spoken easily, even delicately, as if mathematics could define a life. It meant she was 1/4 black by the cruel arithmetic of the time, though her eyes were light, her hair soft, and her bearing proud. The world, it seemed, would forever remind her of fractions. The Alabama of her childhood was not a place of music yet. It was a land trying to remember how to live after tearing itself apart. The war had left behind ghost towns and hungry mouths. The fields, once white with cotton, now grew wild with weeds. The men who returned from battle carried silence in their eyes. The women, left with broken land and broken bodies, turned their hands to survival. Somewhere in that landscape of ruin, a girl learned early that beauty could be a kind of armor and charm a quiet weapon. I sometimes imagine her standing in a doorway of a wooden house that leaned with age, the evening sun turning the red clay road into ribbons of gold. A breeze might have carried the scent of crushed magnolia and the distant murmur of church songs. The grown folks would speak of God, of the war, of debts owed and never paid, while the girl, Lulu Hendley they called her then, would look beyond the fields and dream of places where her name meant something else. In her heart, perhaps, she was already someone new, someone who would one day rename herself with the confidence of queens. The Reconstruction years were hard and long. Freed people searched for kin they had lost to the auction block. The soil was poor, the wages poorer. To be mixed race in that time was to live in a shadow between laws, neither protected nor wholly condemned, yet never free of watchful eyes. The world was changing fast, and the air was thick with talk of rights and wrongs, though none of it put bread on the table. For a young girl with little more than her wits and her face, the road ahead was narrow, but it was a road nonetheless. In the evenings, when the heat loosened its grip, the stars came out like scattered coins across the sky. The frogs began their slow chorus, and the sound carried through the open windows of her house. The grown-ups might whisper about the dangers of the city, New Orleans, that place of noise and color, of Frenchmen and Creoles and music that danced even in sorrow. They said it was no place for a good girl, but sometimes it is precisely the warning that becomes the invitation. Lulu must have felt it then, that restless pull toward the unknown, the promise that somewhere else she could become more than what she was allowed to be here. No one knows the day she left. Perhaps it was sudden, after a quarrel or a heartbreak. Perhaps it was quiet, a simple decision made beneath a sky heavy with rain. She would have been barely a teenager, her possessions few enough to fit into a cloth bundle. I imagine her at dawn, walking the red road alone, the hem of her dress catching the dust. Behind her lay the whispering fields of Alabama, ahead the wide and uncertain path to Louisiana. Some say she boarded a riverboat, others that she traveled by wagon, stopping to rest under cypress trees and abandoned barns. The journey would have been long, miles upon miles of humid air, mosquitoes, and the smell of mud and jasmine. As the days passed, perhaps she thought of her mother, of a face now fading in memory. The road is a cruel tutor. It teaches endurance first, and loneliness next. There must have been nights when she wondered whether she had chosen freedom or exile. But the road kept her moving, as it keeps all wanderers moving. Some lights, once lit, cannot go out. When she reached the edges of New Orleans, the city would have appeared like a mirage, a tangle of roofs and spires, ships bobbing on the river, the faint sound of laughter drifting through the humid air. It was a place where the past met the present in uneasy conversation, where old French balconies leaned over American streets, and every language found its echo. Here, life moved to a rhythm all its own, and perhaps for the first time, she felt she was part of something larger than her own hunger. The New Orleans of the early 1880s was alive with contradictions. In one street, you might find a church bell. In the next, a music hall. There was wealth and poverty, virtue and sin, all pressed close together like dancers at a slow waltz. The city was still rebuilding from the war, yet it carried itself with a strange, weary pride. It was a place where a woman might lose herself or find herself, depending on how she played her cards. Lulu, young and watchful, found work where she could. Some said she started in the kitchens, others that she learned to dance for coins. She was soon seen in the company of men who smelled of tobacco and fine cologne, men whose eyes lingered too long. What began as survival slowly became something else, an education in charm, in conversation, in the secret economies of desire. It was here she learned that men pay dearly not for love, but for the illusion of being seen. The storyteller in me wonders if she felt shame, or if she understood early that the world offered her few choices. Perhaps she thought, if this is the game, then I will play it better than anyone. And she did. She learned the art of the pause, the meaning of a glance. She discovered that beauty, when mixed with intelligence, could be transformed into currency. But for now, she was still that young woman on the edge of the city, standing beneath the yellow glow of a gas lamp, the sound of a trumpet drifting through the night. The Mississippi lay beyond, black and endless, carrying the lights of ships toward places she could only imagine. The air was thick with possibility and danger in equal measure. It is said that every soul carries within it the seed of its own legend. On that night, perhaps without knowing, Lulu White planted hers. The lamp above her flickered. Somewhere, in the dark heart of the city, music began to rise, the first soft tremors of what the world would later call jazz, and the girl, neither child nor woman, took her first step toward the life that would make her both famous and forgotten. Outside her window, the wind stirred the magnolia leaves. The world was still young enough to believe in reinvention. The stars glimmered faintly over the red clay roads of her memory, and the girl who would one day rule New Orleans turned her face toward the city, following the sound of the music. The magnolia leaves whisper behind her as she takes her first steps toward the unknown. The air is thick with the perfume of night-blooming jasmine, and somewhere far away, the faint notes of a trumpet fade into silence. Ahead lies only the road, long, pale, and glimmering faintly under the light of the moon. She walks slowly at first, her shoes raising small clouds of dust that catch the starlight like silver smoke. The world is enormous and quiet. The hum of insects fills the spaces where fear might have been. There is something both heavy and weightless about departure. Every step away from home feels like a betrayal and a liberation all at once. The night carries her forward. Behind her, the fields where she once played dissolve into memory, and before her, a river she has never seen waits somewhere in the dark. Perhaps she hums softly to herself to keep company with the sound of her footsteps, or perhaps she walks in silence, listening to the steady rhythm of her own heart. It was the 1880s, and the South was still a land divided, not by battle lines now, but by invisible walls of class, race, and ruin. Roads stretched across the countryside like veins, leading from small towns to the cities where money moved like water. To walk such a road alone as a young woman was to court both danger and destiny. But perhaps Lulu did not think of danger. Perhaps she thought only of movement, of what it meant to be carried forward, closer to the hum of life. The days along the road would have been long and bright, the sun burning through thin cotton sleeves. Her dress, once neat, would grow stiff with dust. The nights would bring a different kind of beauty, the chirp of crickets, the flash of fireflies across the dark fields. When she rested, she might have slept under trees or near the porches of kind strangers who offered bread and a cup of water. The world of that time was rough, but not yet hurried. Travelers met travelers and parted without names. She would have learned how to be small when needed, quiet when watched, bold when ignored. There must have been moments of wonder, too. Imagine the first time she saw the wide rivers that sliced through the heart of the South, their surfaces gold in the evening light, their currents alive and endless. The Mississippi was a god to the people who lived along its banks, powerful and unpredictable. It carried the hopes of those moving south toward the Gulf and the despair of those drifting away from all they had lost. When Lulu first glimpsed it, perhaps from the deck of a ferry or from the muddy shore, she might have felt that she was looking upon fate itself. The wind that came off the water smelled of salt in faraway places. She followed it westward toward the city where the river bent like a question mark, the place they called New Orleans. It was said that in that city, everyone was from somewhere else. There were men from France and Haiti, women from Cuba, gamblers from the Carolinas, and dreamers from everywhere in between. It was a city that did not care much about the past. It was too busy singing, too busy forgetting. For someone like Lulu, who carried both the marks and the mysteries of mixed blood, such a place might have sounded like salvation. But before she could reach the city, she had to learn how to belong nowhere. A week on the road can teach a person more about themselves than years of comfort. There is no mirror to consult, no familiar hand to hold, only the wind and the occasional voice of another traveler. She would have learned the subtle codes of survival, the tone that tells others you are not to be trifled with, the calm that conceals exhaustion. She would have learned to smile when she needed a ride and to stare back when the wrong kind of eyes lingered too long. Perhaps she thought often of her mother, though memory can be both companion and torment. Did she remember the sound of her mother's voice, the roughness of her hands, or the songs she sang when work was done? Or had time already blurred those details, leaving only a sense of loss that had no name? In the hush between miles, she might have whispered promises to the ghosts of her past, that she would make something of herself, that she would never be poor again, that she would never depend on anyone's mercy. On the 10th, or perhaps the 12th evening of her journey, she came upon a small town where the air was heavy with the scent of cane syrup and roasting corn. The streets were little more than tracks through the mud, lined with weathered shacks and the occasional painted storefront. From one of these places drifted the sound of a fiddle. Men and women danced inside, their laughter spilling into the night like spilled wine. She lingered outside, unseen, and watched. The rhythm was strange, somewhere between sorrow and joy. It made her want to move, to lose herself in it. Perhaps that was the first time she felt the power of music to make the unbearable seem almost holy. She continued on when dawn came, her feet aching, her dress now a patchwork of dust and sweat. But she carried that rhythm with her, like a pulse beneath her ribs. It would follow her all her life, that blending of pleasure and pain, that strange melody that only cities like New Orleans seem to understand. By the time the rooftops of the city came into view, the air had changed. It smelled of salt and spice and something faintly sweet, molasses maybe, or decay. The noise grew louder. Wheels, voices, the cry of gulls, the deep call of riverboats. She stood on a rise and looked down upon it, that restless city built between water and sky. It shimmered in the heat like a dream about to dissolve. Behind her stretched the empty miles of everything she had left behind. Before her, the glitter of promise and ruin intertwined. She took a deep breath and began the slow descent into its heart. The streets were narrower than she had imagined and alive with color. On one corner, a group of children chased a hoop. On another, a woman sold flowers from a basket, her voice lilting in Creole. The houses leaned toward each other, their balconies dripping with iron lace. Everywhere there was sound, bells, footsteps, snatches of song. The rhythm she had heard in that small-town tavern now pulsed through the very air. It was as if the city itself was alive, breathing, calling her name. That first night, she found shelter in a room above a bakery. The walls were thin, and the smell of bread mingled with the dampness of the river. She lay awake listening to the creak of carriages, the distant laughter, the slow rush of the water beyond. The city was vast, unknowable. Somewhere within its folds was her destiny, though she could not yet name it. Outside her window, fireflies blinked like little lanterns over the courtyard. Their light moved in rhythm with the faint sound of a fiddle from a street below. The night air was warm against her skin, and for the first time in many days, she smiled. The road had ended, but the journey had just begun. Somewhere down near the river, a horn began to play, a low, yearning note that trembled like a heartbeat. Lulu turned her face toward the sound. In its music, she felt both promise and warning. She did not yet know that the road of dust and fireflies had merely brought her to the gates of a city that would one day make her legend and then destroy her. For now, there was only the night, the river, and the light of her own restless heart. The horn by the river drifts into silence, leaving only the soft hum of the water against the stones. Lulu lies awake beneath her thin blanket, her eyes tracing the ceiling as if the plaster itself were alive with dreams. Below her, the baker rises before dawn. The smell of yeast and smoke fills the narrow stairwell. Morning slips into the room like a pale ghost, brushing her cheek with its cool fingers. New Orleans awakens. She steps out into the street with the first light. The city seems to breathe differently now that she stands within it, slower, deeper, like a creature half asleep. The air is thick with moisture, rich with the mingled scents of chicory coffee, horse sweat, river mud, and sugar. A carriage clatters past, its wheels spraying puddles from last night's rain. In the distance, bells toll faintly from a church whose spire pierces the mist. The sound folds into the cries of vendors selling fruit, fish, and flowers in the street, their voices bright with a music all their own. The young woman walks carefully, her shoes slipping on the stones, still damp from the night. She keeps her head high, but her eyes move constantly, taking in everything: the pattern of lace curtains, the gleam of brass door knockers, the half-open shutters through which laughter leaks into the morning. The French Quarter is a patchwork of color and contradiction. Houses painted in pale blues and ochres, the iron balconies heavy with vines, the smell of decay twined with the perfume of roses. Life here seems both graceful and unruly, a dance between elegance and ruin. She finds herself drawn toward the heart of the market. There, among the crowded stalls, Creole women sell baskets of figs and peppers, their laughter like small bursts of thunder. A group of men gather near a cart, arguing in a blend of English, French, and something older. A brass band begins to play on the corner, slow, mournful, but with a pulse beneath it that makes her heart stir. The sound is unlike anything she has ever heard. Sorrow made beautiful, rhythm made defiance. She stands still for a long moment, the music washing over her like warm rain. Perhaps she feels in that moment that the city has chosen her. New Orleans has always had a way of recognizing its own, the restless, the wounded, the dreamers who cannot sleep. It offers them both danger and sanctuary, though never in equal measure. As days turn to weeks, she learns the rhythm of the streets. By day, the city moves with lazy grace. By night, it burns quietly, like a candle guttering against the dark. She takes odd work when she can, cleaning, running errands, carrying messages. But it is her beauty that people notice first. Men glance twice. Women, too, study her as she passes, uncertain whether she belongs among them or above them. In those early months, she rents small rooms in different quarters, moving often. Some say she took to the dance halls, learning the way the body can speak when words are too poor a language. Others whisper that she was already seen in the company of gentlemen, merchants, sailors, men with watch chains and quiet appetites. The truth, like most things about Lulu, is likely somewhere between rumor and necessity. At night, she sometimes walks along the levee. The river glimmers beneath the lanterns of passing ships, and the wind carries the faint music of the taverns inland. She watches the lights moving slowly downstream and wonders what it would feel like to follow them, to vanish into the horizon without leaving a name behind. Yet each morning she remains. The city is a magnet. It holds those who dare to dream and dares them to never leave. There are moments of tenderness amid the hardship. Perhaps a kind woman in a boarding house teaches her how to pin her hair in the latest style, or a musician gives her a smile that lingers too long. But such warmth is fleeting. The city does not allow innocence to survive for long. It trades in illusions, and Lulu learns to craft them with quiet precision. She learns how to listen more than she speaks, how to let her silence draw others nearer. Soon she moves within circles that exist behind closed doors, parlors where the air smells of cigars and perfume, where laughter curls like smoke. There she learns the first rules of the hidden world, how to read a man's desire before he names it, how to flatter without surrendering, how to appear untouched by what must be endured. Every smile is practice, every gesture a step toward survival. Yet beneath the surface, something in her begins to harden and shine. The poverty, the long road, the small humiliations, all of it is transmuted into resolve. She begins to imagine a different kind of life, one where she owns the room rather than merely stands within it. The city hums around her, alive with opportunity disguised as sin. Sometimes she walks alone along Basin Street at dusk. The lamps flicker on one by one, their light soft as candle flame. The air tastes faintly of oranges and rain. She watches the silhouettes of men entering houses where the shutters are always drawn. Each doorway glows for a moment before swallowing them whole. She knows, without yet knowing how, that her future lies behind one of those doors, not as a guest, but as the keeper. The nights stretch long and humid. Somewhere, a piano spills laughter into the streets. Somewhere else, a woman sings of heartbreak in a voice so weary it becomes divine. Lulu listens, and something within her stirs, an understanding that beauty and sorrow are often born in the same breath. She has not yet become the woman who will be called the Diamond Queen, but already the crown is forming in the quiet spaces of her mind. One evening, as she returns to her room, she pauses before a mirror. The glass is cracked down the middle, dividing her reflection in two. For a long while, she studies the halves, one soft, one sharp. Then, with a faint smile, she touches the line between them, as if sealing a pact. Outside, the rain begins again, soft and steady. The music from a nearby saloon floats up through the shutters, a low, restless melody that seems to echo her own heart. She sits by the window and listens, her hands folded in her lap. The city is still awake, whispering its promises and its lies. Tomorrow she will rise again and walk those same streets, her eyes clear and her step certain. New Orleans is teaching her its language, and she is learning quickly. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, thunder rolls, distant but coming closer. She does not yet know its name, but it will soon be called Storyville. The thunder that rumbled beyond the rooftops did not bring rain but change. The city was shifting, drawing invisible lines through its streets, and somewhere behind those lines, Lulu began to find her place. In the weeks that followed, the air seemed thicker, as though New Orleans itself was holding its breath. By day, the streets were noisy with vendors and preachers. By night, the glow of gas lamps blurred into halos of mist. And in the reflections of shop windows and half-polished mirrors, Lulu began to see someone she barely recognized. She had taken a small room near Basin Street now, above a shop that sold fabrics imported from Havana. Each morning, she would stand before the mirror that hung above her wash basin, a small, imperfect piece of glass that caught the light unevenly, and study the woman who stared back. The girl from Alabama had faded, leaving in her place a creature of poise and composure. She had learned how to arrange her hair just so, how to let her eyes linger long enough to make others uneasy, how to speak softly and be heard nonetheless. The city was changing its laws and its desires. Whispers began to circulate about a man named Sidney Story, a politician with a plan to cleanse the city by containing its vice. He spoke of order and decency, of separating sin from society by drawing a map around it. They would call the new district Storyville, and within its borders, the pleasures the city could not destroy would at least be managed. It was said that the women there would be licensed, their trade cataloged in little blue books for anyone with a coin and a conscience light enough to open them. Lulu listened to these murmurs in the parlors and taverns where she moved like a shadow. To most, Storyville was a threat. To her, it was an opportunity. The city was about to create a kingdom, and she understood that kingdoms always required queens. She began to visit the brothels already operating in the area, not as a client, but as an observer. She studied the rooms, the gilt mirrors, the velvet curtains, the heavy scents of perfume and sweat that hung in the air. She watched how men carried themselves when they thought no one was watching, and how women survived by pretending they were not dying inside. Some of these houses were grand with chandeliers and champagne. Others were little more than shacks with a piano missing half its keys. Yet everywhere she saw the same truth. Beauty could command loyalty, but only intelligence could command power. Lulu began to climb. She started as a hostess, then as an organizer, the quiet mind behind the chaos of other people's desires. She learned the rhythms of the trade, the ebb and flow of wealth, the seasons of pleasure. The scent of rosewater became part of her, and the mirror became her confidant. She would spend long minutes before it each night, removing her jewelry one by one, her face unreadable. Sometimes she smiled at her reflection, as if sharing a secret. Sometimes she did not smile at all. It was in those nights that she began to weave her legend. Clients came to her not just for her company, but for her presence. She could speak to a man as though she saw through him, and somehow he would thank her for it. Her laughter was low and deliberate, the kind that made others lean closer. And when she walked through the streets of the new Storyville, people turned to look, not with lust, but with curiosity. There was something about her that did not belong to the world she occupied. The mirror became her ritual, her altar. Each evening before the gaslights were lit, she would trace her reflection with her fingertip, as though confirming she still existed. What she saw there was no longer the child of Alabama's fields, nor the girl who once trembled at the sound of a fiddle. She was now a woman carved from ambition and endurance, a creature who had made peace with her own myth. In the stillness of her room, the mirror caught her image and multiplied it endlessly, until even she could no longer tell where truth ended and invention began. There were men who sought to possess her, to make her part of their households or their fortunes. She refused them all. Marriage was a kind of cage, she believed, no matter how gilded. She preferred the uncertainty of her own making to the comfort of belonging to another. Rumors followed her, of course. They always do. Some said she had a patron among the city's politicians, others that she dabbled in the dark arts of persuasion. She did not correct them. In her world, mystery was worth more than honesty, and so she built her reputation quietly like a craftsman shaping glass. By the time Storyville opened in 1897, Lulu White was ready. She had already saved more than most men would see in their lifetimes, and her name was whispered with a mix of admiration and envy. Yet she wanted more than money. She wanted permanence, a structure, a space, something solid enough to outlast the fleeting warmth of desire. Sometimes at night she would walk through the new district, the muddy streets echoing with piano notes and laughter. She would pause before an empty lot on Basin Street, a corner that caught the afternoon light just so. There she imagined a grand building rising from the earth, a house of wood and marble and glass, built for pleasure but crafted like a cathedral. She could almost hear the music inside, the sound of crystal glasses touching, the murmur of voices softened by velvet walls. She could see herself at the center of it, standing in a room of mirrors, surrounded by her own reflection, each one a version of herself, each one a mask she had mastered. The image stayed with her long after she returned home. Sometimes she dreamed of it, a hall glowing with golden light, her name spoken in every corner of the city. But when she awoke, it was not joy she felt, but a strange kind of calm, as if the future were no longer waiting for her, but already unfolding. On one of those nights, a storm moved across the river. The wind rattled the shutters, and the lamp by her bedside flickered uncertainly. Lulu sat before her mirror again, watching the flame tremble behind her reflection. In that moment, she realized how fragile it all was. Beauty, fortune, even memory. But she also understood something deeper, that fragility itself was power. To live within it, to control it, was to defy the world that had sought to break her since birth. She leaned closer to the glass until her breath fogged its surface. Mahogany, she whispered softly, as if testing the weight of the word. Yes, mahogany. A name for the color of her skin, for the wood she would choose for her walls, for the richness she would carve from the shadows. Outside, the rain began to fall in earnest, tapping against the windows like fingertips. She did not move. Her reflection wavered in the lamplight, then steadied again, a woman gazing back with eyes that already saw what others could not. When morning came, the mirror was still damp with the breath of her ambition. The storm had passed, but the name remained, shimmering quietly in the air. Mahogany Hall. The storm that had whispered against her window left the streets washed clean, and in the stillness that followed, the city began to remake itself. Morning broke through clouds the color of pewter, and from her window, Lulu watched the light spill over Basin Street like liquid gold. The puddles reflected the balconies and the laundry lines, the shadows of passing carriages, and the stray dogs wandering between them. Somewhere, faint and distant, a trumpet began to play, hesitant at first, like a man testing his breath after a long silence. It was the same sound she had once heard by the river when she first arrived, only now it belonged to her city, to her time. That morning, the paper spoke of the new district, how the council had drawn its borders, how the law would finally keep its promise to confine vice to one place. Prostitution, the writers said, would no longer shame the city, but live in the open under the name of Storyville. It would be mapped and measured, its people numbered like properties. The men of the council wrote it as reform. The women who lived its truth called it something else, containment. But Lulu read those words differently. To her, the ordinance was not a fence. It was a stage. The city had built a theater for pleasure, and she intended to write herself into its script. The district began to take form slowly, like a bruise beneath the skin. The houses nearest the river filled first, Small rooms, rough laughter, the smell of gin and sweat rising through the summer air. Carpenters and painters worked day and night, their hammers keeping rhythm with the city's restless heart. Parlors opened behind lace curtains. Pianos arrived in wagons. Men from uptown came wandering through, curious and ashamed. The name Storyville spread like rumor and then like promise. Lulu walked those new streets with quiet authority. She studied the layout, the curve of Basin Street, the narrow alleys where music pooled like rainwater, the dim-lit doors that marked the beginnings of what the newspapers called the Tenderloin. Every corner held possibility. She was not alone in recognizing it. Other women, some desperate, some cunning, moved among the carpenters and landlords, securing leases, bribing officials, claiming territory. It was an invisible war fought with charm, timing, and cash. Lulu had more of all three than most. She knew where to place her coin and when to hold her silence. Within weeks, she had acquired a plot near the center of the district, an unremarkable lot at 235 Basin Street, but one that caught the morning sun and the night breeze from the river. Standing there one evening, she could already see it. Her hall of mahogany and marble, the palace the city did not yet know it would build for her. But before the foundation could be laid, she had to build something more fragile: belief. In those months, Lulu moved between two worlds. By day, she visited banks and suppliers, always dressed in quiet elegance, her gloves white and her speech measured. She spoke to men who doubted her and left them uncertain whether they had underestimated her or simply misunderstood. By night, she returned to the taverns and drawing rooms where her reputation was born, whispering plans to those who might invest or protect her. Some men laughed at her ambition. Others, sensing profit or danger, agreed to lend their names. It is said that more than one politician's signature found its way onto the documents that gave her ownership of the lot. History rarely records such things, but the walls of Basin Street remembered. As the months passed, the bones of her vision began to rise from the earth. The foundation stones arrived by barge. The scent of fresh timber mingled with the river's damp breath. Workmen cursed and sang as they built, unaware that they were constructing not merely a brothel, but a legend. The front steps were laid first, broad, polished, meant to be ascended slowly. Inside, she demanded nothing less than perfection. Marble floors, carved banisters, mirrors so tall they could reflect a man's vanity from every angle. The rooms would be lit by gas lamps softened through silk shades, the walls lined with wood dark as wine. When the workmen asked what to call the place, she told them gently, "Mahogany Hall." The name rolled off her tongue as if it had always been waiting. The city watched her rise with fascination and disapproval. The newspapers hinted at scandal, though they never printed her name outright. Preachers thundered from their pulpits, warning that sin now had an address. But at night, the same men who condemned her by day sent their carriages to Basin Street, their wheels clattering against the cobblestones as if applauding her defiance. New Orleans had always been a city of contradictions, and Lulu embodied them all. Elegance and excess, propriety and transgression, sin gilded with grace. She spent evenings overseeing every detail of her creation. The fabrics, the perfumes, the music, all chosen to create a mood that was less about lust than illusion. Mahogany Hall, she told her girls, was not a house of shame, but a temple of art. Each guest who entered would believe, if only for a moment, that the world had become softer, more forgiving. She taught them to speak gently, to move like dancers, to smile without revealing hunger. "You sell the dream," she would whisper, "never the truth." In those months, Basin Street transformed. The sound of pianos spilled into the night. The laughter of men mixed with the faint sadness of a trumpet solo drifting from somewhere unseen. Storyville became a world unto itself, separate from the rest of New Orleans, yet inseparable from its soul. It was said that within those few blocks, one could find the whole of the human condition for a handful of dollars: desire, regret, and the fleeting illusion of love. Sometimes, after the workers had gone and the hall was quiet, Lulu would walk through its unfinished rooms. She would trail her fingers along the polished wood, smell the varnish, listen to the echo of her footsteps. The mirrors were not yet hung, and the bare walls reflected only shadows. She imagined them filled with light and laughter, with music that would carry her name beyond the city. For all her pragmatism, she believed in omens, and there was one she never forgot. One evening, as she stood in the grand hallway, the last light of day slipped through the tall windows and turned the new mahogany walls the color of blood and honey. She took it as a blessing, or perhaps a warning. It is hard to tell the difference when one stands on the edge of destiny. Outside, the air grew heavy again, the scent of magnolia and whiskey blending in the dusk. The first guests were already whispering about the opening of the most lavish house in the South. The name Lulu White was spoken with reverence and disbelief, as though she were not quite real. She returned home late that night, her gloves stained faintly with sawdust, her hair damp from the river air. Before sleeping, she lit a small candle and placed it before her mirror. The flame wavered, and her reflection shimmered with it. For a long moment she watched herself in silence, as if trying to decide whether the woman she saw was building a house or a monument. The candle burned low. Outside, somewhere down Basin Street, a trumpet began to play again, slow and tender, a melody that rose and fell like breath. Lulu closed her eyes and listened, the music twining through her dreams until it became part of her story. The next morning, she would open the doors of Mahogany Hall. But that night, she slept surrounded by the scent of fresh wood and the faint hum of the city, dreaming of mirrors and music, of silk and sin, of the light that glows brightest just before the dawn. The trumpet's last note lingered in her dream, a soft thread of sound that followed Lulu into waking. When she opened her eyes, the dawn had already spilled across the windowsill, gilding the dust that floated in the air. The scent of new varnish clung to everything, sweet and thick, mingled with the sharper perfume of roses from the courtyard below. Outside, Basin Street was stirring, carriages creaking, vendors calling, the faint laughter of girls preparing for another day. And at the heart of it all stood her creation, the hall that bore her name like a secret, Mahogany Hall. She rose slowly, wrapped herself in a robe of pale silk, and stepped to the window. The street shimmered faintly with humidity, and the building across the way caught the morning light along its carved edges. It seemed almost alive, breathing with the pulse of the city. The front doors, polished to a mirror sheen, gleamed beneath their brass fixtures. The sign had not yet been hung, but everyone in Storyville already knew where the new house stood. Some had waited months to see it. Others had waited all their lives. By mid-afternoon, Mahogany Hall awoke fully. Workers carried in the last pieces of furniture, a piano with keys white as bone, a bar of dark oak lined with silver rails. Lulu moved among them like a conductor guiding an orchestra. She touched every surface, adjusted every curtain, gave small instructions in her calm, unhurried voice. Her hands, once rough from work and travel, were now soft but sure. Even the men who had built the hall stepped lightly around her, sensing that this was not merely another business, but something more, an act of transformation. When evening arrived, the first gas lamps were lit, and the building glowed from within like a lantern. The marble floors reflected the light in warm pools. The mahogany walls drank it in and gave it back softer, deeper. Music drifted from the parlor, a slow waltz played by a young pianist whose name she had forgotten, but whose touch she trusted. The girls moved through the rooms in gowns of pale silk and lace, their laughter quiet, rehearsed. Lulu had chosen each of them herself, not only for beauty, but for presence. Elegance, she had told them, is not what you wear, it's what you make others feel. She stood at the top of the staircase as the first guests arrived. her hair crowned with a small tiara, her hands covered in jewels that caught the lamplight. She was neither young nor old that night. She seemed timeless, as though carved from the same dark wood as the walls that surrounded her. Men greeted her with bows and uncertain smiles. They were merchants, politicians, travelers, men whose names filled the newspapers and whose secrets she would one day hold. Each came for the same reason, to see what had never been seen before. Mahogany Hall was not a house of sin, not tonight. It was a theater, and Lulu its queen. The air was thick with perfume and the low hum of conversation. Champagne glasses clinked. A violin joined the piano. Somewhere, a woman laughed softly, and her voice floated up toward the balcony where Lulu stood. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe it in, the culmination of every step that had led her here. The long road from Alabama, the dust, the hunger, the cold nights beside the river. All of it had led to this soft glow of light, this moment suspended between ambition and immortality. And yet, even amid the laughter, she felt a stillness within herself. Perhaps she sensed that joy was only ever rented, never owned. Perhaps she knew that every empire, no matter how carefully built, begins to crumble the moment it is complete. But she did not dwell on it. The music swelled, and she descended the staircase slowly, each step deliberate, as if measuring the distance between who she had been and who she had become. When she reached the parlor, a hush passed through the room. It was not silence, but something subtler, the kind of pause that follows reverence. She smiled, and the guests began to breathe again. She greeted them as an equal, not a servant. Her voice low and smooth. The diamond rings on her fingers caught the lamplight with every gesture. In that moment, she embodied what New Orleans had always been, bold, decadent, unapologetically alive. Hours passed in a haze of laughter and music. The wine flowed freely. The girls danced and whispered and disappeared behind doors. Lulu moved through it all like a spirit of the house. Her presence felt even when unseen. She poured drinks, listened to confidences, offered small comforts. Her gift was not seduction, it was understanding. She knew what men feared most was not rejection, but being forgotten, and so she made each of them feel remembered, if only for a night. Outside, the sound of the river carried faintly on the wind. The steamboats called to one another in low moans that drifted over the rooftops. Somewhere, a trumpet answered, playful, mournful. It was said later that Jelly Roll Morton played that night, though whether it was him or another hardly matters. The music itself was the miracle, new, unrefined, full of hunger. The melody seeped through the windows and into the street, mingling with the rhythm of passing footsteps. Even those who could not afford the price of admission would linger outside to hear it. Near midnight, Lulu slipped away from the crowd and climbed to the top floor, where the noise faded into a distant hum. From a small balcony, she looked down upon the city, the glow of lanterns, the faint movement of shadows along Basin Street. The moon was low, silvering the roofs and chimneys. She leaned against the railing and closed her eyes. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to feel pride, unaccompanied by fear. But pride is a delicate thing, easily shattered. Behind her, the door opened and one of her girls stepped out. "Madame," the young woman whispered, "there's a gentleman downstairs who asks for you by name." Lulu turned, the lamplight catching the red stones in her earrings. "Tell him," she said with a faint smile, "that Madame White will be down shortly." The title, spoken aloud, settled over her like a crown. When she returned to the parlor, the man was gone, but the hall was still alive with laughter and music. She took it as a sign. The city itself had called her name, and for tonight, she had answered. The celebration lasted until dawn. When the last guest had departed and the last lamp had been extinguished, Lulu remained alone in the great foyer. The air was heavy with the scent of perfume and smoke, the floor littered with petals from the bouquets that had decorated the tables. She stood before the tall mirror at the base of the staircase and studied her reflection. Her hair was slightly disordered, her eyes ringed with fatigue, but there was a softness in her face that even she had not expected. The hall around her was silent now, its grandeur dimmed by the pale light creeping through the curtains. She touched the glass with her fingertips, tracing her reflection as she had done so many times before. The surface was cool, unyielding. For a moment, it seemed as if the woman inside the mirror were breathing separately from the one who stood before it. "Mahogany," she whispered again, and the words seemed to echo faintly, absorbed by the still air. Outside, a steamboat's horn moaned across the river. The city would soon wake, but for now, it belonged to her. She turned from the mirror and walked toward the staircase, her bare feet whispering across the marble floor. Behind her, the first rays of morning slipped through the high windows, touching the mahogany panels until they glowed like embers. And somewhere in that light, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of a single note, a trumpet tuning itself for the next song. The trumpet's solitary note lingered in the dawn, thin as silk and trembling with promise. It wove itself through the still air of Mahogany Hall, rising up the staircase where Lulu had paused, one hand resting lightly on the banister. She could not see the musician who played it, but she smiled faintly, as though the sound had been meant only for her. Outside, the light grew stronger, spilling across the marble floors, and the mirrors still fogged with the breath of last night's revelry. The city, exhausted yet insatiable, began to stir again, and with it rose the legend of the woman they were beginning to call the Diamond Queen. For weeks the name Mahogany Hall passed from mouth to mouth like a charm. Gentlemen whispered it behind cigars in their clubs. Women mentioned it in hushed tones while pretending not to care. Even the newspapers, careful not to name her outright, spoke of a house of unparalleled elegance on Basin Street, where no vulgarity was permitted, where music flowed like perfume and beauty obeyed its own laws. To be seen entering those polished doors became both a risk and a privilege, and at the heart of it all stood Lulu White, half myth, half flesh, her smile as carefully measured as her accounts. She understood the delicate balance between indulgence and ruin. Wealth could be courted, but never trusted. Power could be borrowed, never owned outright. So she made her fortune appear effortless, her splendor natural, as though she had been born among silks rather than dust. Each evening she dressed herself slowly, choosing her jewels with precision, a cascade of diamonds for her neck, ruby rings for her fingers, a red wig that glowed beneath the lamplight like fire. Her gowns were made in Paris, her perfumes imported from Havana. She did not simply enter a room, she appeared in it, and the air changed. But for all her display, there was an order to her excess. She ruled her house with quiet discipline, demanding punctuality, cleanliness, and a certain grace from those who worked beneath her. The girls of Mahogany Hall learned that their smiles were as valuable as their beauty, that no laughter was to be shrill, no conversation coarse. Guests paid not merely for pleasure but for refinement, for the illusion that they had stepped into a world untouched by the city's grime and noise. Lulu walked among them each night, her footsteps soft against the carpet, her voice low but commanding. When she spoke, even the most boisterous guests lowered their tones. She was never cruel, but she was never kind without purpose. Music became the soul of Mahogany Hall. In the evenings, the parlor filled with the sound of piano keys, the gentle strum of a banjo, the distant cry of a trumpet. Jelly Roll Morton was said to have played there, his fingers dancing across the keys with the reckless joy of youth. Joe King. Oliver visited often, bringing with him the energy of the streets, and among the boys who lingered near the doorway, too young to enter but old enough to listen, was one named Louis Armstrong. He would later say that he could hear Lulu's music from blocks away, the rhythm carrying over the rooftops like a heartbeat. It was in those nights that jazz, still unnamed and raw, began to take shape, its melodies twisting upward from sin into art. Inside, the rooms glowed with mirrors and laughter. The marble floors reflected the shimmer of crystal glasses. The air was heavy with perfume and smoke. Lulu moved through it all like a phantom of her own creation, smiling at familiar faces, introducing strangers to one another, offering small jokes that left people thinking long after they had laughed. When she poured wine, she did it as though performing a ceremony. When she sat at the piano bench beside a musician, the men fell silent. She would rest her hand lightly on the keys, not playing, merely listening. To them, she seemed part of the music itself, an instrument tuned to the city's restless soul. Outside the hall, however, the world was less forgiving. The same men who toasted her at night condemned her by day. Preachers spoke of her in sermons without daring to speak her name. Police officers came often, their visits marked by the exchange of envelopes and courteous smiles. She paid what was required, and the city pretended to be cleansed. It was an old game, and Lulu played it better than most. Still, there were nights when she stood alone in her office, the ledgers open before her, the sound of distant laughter seeping through the walls, and wondered how long balance could last in a world built on secrecy. She kept her fortune in banks that did not ask questions, and in jewels she could hide if she needed to disappear. Her portrait hung above the staircase, a gift from a painter who owed her both money and gratitude. It showed her seated in a velvet chair, her gaze direct, her expression unreadable. Visitors often paused before it, unsure whether they were looking at a woman or an idea. In truth, she was both. Lulu White had turned herself into a myth while she still breathed, and yet, for all her control, there were cracks she could not mend. She had lovers, of course, but never a companion. The men who tried to own her found that she could not be kept. The women who envied her never understood that her power was also her solitude. Sometimes, when the music slowed and the guests had drifted away, she would walk through the empty rooms barefoot, her skirts whispering against the marble. The mirrors reflected her endlessly, dozens of Lulus, each one smiling at no one. In those moments, she might pause before one reflection longer than the others, her face softening as if she had seen a stranger she almost remembered. Outside, the city continued its nightly pulse. Storyville was alive with sound, the rustle of dresses, the murmur of men's voices, the clatter of glasses, the faint echo of a cornet carried on the damp air. Lulu stood at her balcony, listening. The stars above the Mississippi were faint, blurred by smoke and fog. Somewhere far away, a train called out as it left the station, its cry lonely and eternal. She wondered what it would be like to leave, to start again in another place where her name meant nothing. But she knew she would never go. New Orleans was not merely the stage upon which she performed, it was her reflection, her accomplice, her rival. A breeze lifted the curtains, bringing with it the scent of river water and magnolia. The candles flickered, and for an instant the mirrors seemed to breathe. Lulu turned away and descended the staircase once more, her diamonds glinting in the candlelight. The music below had begun again, a slow, rolling tune that spoke of love, regret, and everything between. As she stepped into the parlor, the pianist looked up. "Madame," he said softly, "shall we play your favorite?" Lulu smiled, a slow curve of lips that could have meant anything. "Play what the night asks for," she said. The man nodded and his fingers found the keys. The melody rose, winding through the hall, filling the air with a sweetness that hurt to hear. Lulu closed her eyes and let it surround her. For a moment she felt weightless, almost holy. Outside, dawn began to press faintly at the edge of the horizon, but inside Mahogany Hall the lamps burned on, and the music did not end. The night inside Mahogany Hall did not end when the guests left. It simply shifted, as if the air itself exhaled, surrendering to a quieter rhythm. When the laughter faded and the lights dimmed, the house took on another kind of life, a secret one, softer and slower. Beneath the grand staircase in a corner of the lower parlor, the musicians stayed behind. They lingered long after the clinking of glasses had ceased, their fingers tracing the remnants of songs across ivory and brass. Lulu liked to sit above them sometimes, unseen, the hem of her robe brushing against the balustrade. From there, she could watch without being part of it, the way a queen might listen to the prayers of her subjects. The sound rose up to her in ripples, piano, cornet, laughter, half swallowed in fatigue. It was a kind of alchemy, turning the long ache of living into something beautiful. That was how she first came to know Jelly Roll Morton, a boy then thin as a reed, eyes alive with mischief and genius. He played with the ease of someone who didn't yet realize he was making history. His fingers were always restless, his rhythms unafraid to wander. Sometimes, when the hall was empty but for the musicians, Lulu would come down barefoot, her diamonds hidden, her face bare of powder. She would sit at the edge of the piano bench, listening as the notes tumbled into one another like dice. "You play like you're talking to God," she told him once. Morton laughed, his teeth flashing in the lamplight. "Maybe I am," he said, "but I doubt he's listening." Lulu smiled faintly. "Oh, he's listening. He just prefers the sinners who know they're sinning." They said nothing after that, just let the music fill the silence. The rhythm crept up the stairs, into the walls, into the city beyond. Storyville had become its own kind of organism, breathing, pulsing, sweating sound, and Mahogany Hall was its heart. On humid nights, when the shutters were thrown open to let the air move, people gathered outside the building just to hear the songs drifting out. Couples danced in the street, boys leaned against the lampposts, their faces lit by the soft glow from within. Sometimes, when the band played late enough, even the policemen paused on their rounds, their boots tapping unconsciously in time. But music, like pleasure, carried a shadow. It was born from pain, from the bruised rhythm of lives that had little else to offer the world. Lulu understood that better than most. She recognized in the trembling cornet and the mournful piano the same hunger that had driven her from Alabama to the banks of the Mississippi. She knew that what people called beauty was often just desperation refined into melody. When she walked through the hall at night, she would run her fingers along the polished banister, feeling the faint vibration of the music beneath her skin. She thought of it as the house's pulse. Without it, the place would be only wood and marble, a cage dressed in velvet. But with it, Mahogany Hall lived. One evening, as the musicians packed up, Lulu stayed by the door. The air smelled of smoke and spilled wine. She watched as Jelly Roll slung his jacket over his shoulder and turned toward her. "You'll be famous one day," she said quietly. "People will remember your songs when they've forgotten everything else." He grinned, adjusting his hat. "And what about you, Miss Lulu? What will they remember of you?" She thought for a moment, her hand resting on the doorframe. "The sound," she said finally. "They'll remember the sound that came out of this place." He nodded as if he understood, though he couldn't have known what she meant. When he was gone, she closed the door softly and stood for a long time, listening to the silence that followed him out into the night. Upstairs, the mirrors caught the moonlight and fractured it into fragments of silver. The air was thick and still, heavy with the sweetness of roses left too long in water. Lulu climbed the stairs slowly, her bare feet silent on the marble. From the window at the landing, she could see the river shimmering in the distance, a ribbon of light winding through darkness. Some nights she imagined she could hear it speaking, a slow murmur, like memory itself. The same river that had carried her toward this life now carried away the songs played beneath her stairs. The music would float down to the docks, out across the Gulf, to places where no one would know her name. That thought comforted her, strangely. In the mornings, before the girls awoke and the hall resumed its glamour, Lulu would walk through the rooms while the air was still cool. She would open the shutters, letting in the pale light of dawn. Dust motes rose in the air, turning gold as the sun touched them. Sometimes she found a sheet of music left behind on a table, a scrawl of notes, a forgotten fragment. She never threw them away. She kept them in a drawer in her private study, a small collection of ghosts. There were moments when she wondered what it would have been like to be a musician herself, to create something pure instead of orchestrating the desires of others. But she was not built for purity. She knew that. Her art was of a different kind, an art of presentation, illusion, control. Still, when she stood alone in the empty parlor, she would hum softly to herself, the tune barely audible, the echo of a melody she could never quite claim. As the years passed, the sound of Mahogany Hall became a fixture of Storyville's nights. Musicians came and went, but the rhythm endured. The newspapers called it syncopation. The polite world called it indecent, and the people who danced to it called it freedom. Lulu called it breathing. Late one evening, she descended the stairs after the guests had gone. The lamps were dim, their flames guttering in the damp air. She paused at the bottom, listening. There it was again, the faint hum of a piano, played by someone who had lingered after closing. She followed the sound and found a boy no older than 17 sitting at the keys, lost in his own rhythm. He looked up, startled when he saw her. "I didn't mean to stay, ma'am," he said quickly. She shook her head. "Don't apologize. Keep playing." He hesitated, then began again, slower this time. The notes were uncertain, but there was feeling in them, something honest and unguarded. Lulu stood beside him, her hands folded loosely before her. When he finished, she nodded once. "You'll go far," she said softly. "But remember, don't play for the money. Play for the nights when no one is listening." He smiled shyly, unsure whether she was blessing him or warning him. Perhaps she didn't know herself. Later, after he had gone, she closed the piano lid and rested her palm against the wood. The silence that followed was deep, almost sacred. She could still feel the echo of the music beneath her hand, faint but alive. Outside, the river wind pressed gently against the windows, carrying with it the smell of salt and rain. The city was asleep, but Mahogany Hall was still awake, still breathing, still listening. Lulu turned off the last lamp and began to climb the staircase. Halfway up, she paused and looked back into the darkened parlor, where the shadows seemed to shimmer faintly with sound. She smiled. "Play on," she whispered to the ghosts. And beneath the stairs, though no one touched the keys, a single note seemed to answer her. That single note beneath the stairs lingered through the night, long after Lulu had left the parlor. It was still in her ears when she awoke the next morning, the ghost of a tone that had no source, no player. Perhaps it was the hall itself, remembering the hands that had touched its instruments, or perhaps it was only her mind replaying what it wished to keep. Outside, the first light seeped through the lace curtains, and Basin Street began to hum again, the sound of horses, of street vendors, of lives continuing as though the night's magic had never existed. She stood at the window, gazing down at the waking city. From above, New Orleans looked peaceful, almost serene. But she knew better. Every street here was a performance, every smile a mask. Behind the shutters of respectability, men whispered, plotted, desired. Storyville, for all its noise, was only a reflection of the greater city, a place where vice was allowed to wear its face openly. And now, as her fame spread, those same people who had created this playground of indulgence began to look upon her with the unease of those who recognize too much of themselves in another. By mid-morning, the first letters arrived. One from a newspaper editor, another from a church committee. Both couched their disapproval in careful words, calling for reform, for moral order, for the protection of decency. Lulu read them without reaction, then folded them neatly and placed them in a box on her desk. She would keep them, as she kept everything, not out of sentiment but as evidence. The city that condemned her by daylight could not erase the fact that, when night fell, its finest sons still came to kneel at her door. As she dressed, her maid entered with a copy of The Times-Picayune. On the front page was an article describing the growing influence of Storyville, its dens of luxury, and the colored madams who ruled them. The language was meant to offend, yet beneath its moral outrage, there was fascination. Lulu's name was not printed, but her description was unmistakable. The red-haired woman, Creole of uncertain origin, whose establishment was said to outshine the salons of Paris. She laughed quietly, a sound without warmth, and set the paper aside. By afternoon, she was once again the mistress of her hall. The gas lamps were polished, the mirrors wiped clean. The girls rehearsed their small performances of laughter and charm, but beneath the surface there was tension. The police had begun visiting more frequently, not raiding, merely appearing. They came in pairs, hats tipped, smiles polite. They asked to see her license, to check her registers, to remind her of the boundaries of the district. Lulu offered them drinks, a few soft words, and the promise that Mahogany Hall always obeyed the law. They left with full pockets and empty threats. Still, their presence left ripples. The musicians played softer those nights. The laughter in the parlor came more carefully. Lulu, always poised, began to notice how the world beyond her walls was watching. She felt the eyes of the city not as admiration now, but as curiosity sharpened into suspicion. Perhaps she had grown too visible, too powerful for comfort. In a city where women of her color were expected to remain silent or hidden, her success was both a triumph and a provocation. She responded as she always had, with elegance. The following week, she hosted a ball unlike any other. Invitations were delivered by hand, written in French script on cream-colored paper. A celebration of beauty and harmony, the cards read, at Mahogany Hall, 235 Basin Street. The city's elite came, pretending not to recognize one another beneath their masks. The rooms filled with perfume, silk, and music. Lulu herself appeared near midnight, wearing a gown of white satin and diamonds that caught the candlelight like stars. She moved through the crowd as if floating, her smile gentle, her manner unhurried. The guests drank, danced, and whispered. Somewhere near the piano, a judge laughed with a senator. Across the room, a banker removed his mask to reveal himself to a woman who had known him too well. Lulu watched them all from the staircase, her gaze steady. To her, they were not threats or patrons. They were pieces of the same fragile illusion she had built. The hall existed because they needed it to exist. As long as they desired escape, she would remain their confessor. Near dawn, when the last guests had departed and the candles burned low, Lulu walked through the rooms, collecting the remains of the evening, a glove left behind, a broken fan, a glass still half full. The hall smelled of roses and smoke, the air heavy with the ghosts of laughter. She paused by the grand piano, tracing the rim of a wine glass that trembled faintly against the wood. The sound it made was pure and mournful, a single note echoing her solitude. Outside, the sky was paling. The first streetcar clanged in the distance, its metal wheels screeching against the tracks. The city was waking again, indifferent and eternal. Lulu opened the balcony doors, letting in the cool morning air. From where she stood, she could see the rooftops of Storyville, the crooked chimneys, the fading gaslights, the slow curl of smoke rising from the bakeries. New Orleans was beautiful in this hour when it pretended to be innocent, yet even as she looked upon it, she felt a chill. Power, she knew, was a dance as delicate as any waltz. Too much grace, and one might be mistaken for harmless. Too much strength, and the room might turn against you. She wondered how long she could maintain the balance. Behind her, the door creaked softly. One of her girls entered carrying a tray of tea. "Madame," she said, "will you rest?" Lulu smiled faintly, shaking her head. "Not yet." She turned her gaze back to the horizon, where the sun was breaking through the clouds in pale threads of gold. "The city is watching," she said softly, "and I must be watching too." The girl hesitated, unsure what to say, then withdrew quietly. Lulu remained by the window, her hand resting on the railing. The wind stirred her hair, lifting the faint scent of her perfume into the dawn. Somewhere below, a newspaper boy called out the headlines, his voice high and urgent. She listened for a moment, then closed the doors, shutting out the world. The noise faded, replaced once again by the deep hush of her hall. She walked down the marble corridor, her footsteps echoing softly, and descended the stairs toward the parlor. There, the morning light caught the mirrors and scattered it into 1,000 fragments. For an instant, she seemed surrounded by herself, dozens of reflections, each one watching, each one waiting. The city outside might whisper, accuse, admire. It could love her or condemn her. It mattered little. Within these walls, she was still sovereign, yet as she reached the last step, she paused, sensing that the world beyond her mirrors was beginning to move against her, slow and inevitable as the tide. In the silence that followed, she could almost hear the faint creak of the city turning its gaze toward Basin Street. That creak of the city's gaze did not fade. It settled around her, invisible but present, like humidity that clung to every breath. Lulu felt it each morning when she stood at the window, an awareness that she had crossed some unseen threshold between fascination and resentment. Mahogany Hall continued to shine, its rooms full, its accounts swelling, yet beneath its perfume and velvet, a new tension rippled through the air. The same men who had once toasted her name now watched her too closely, afraid perhaps that her power reflected too clearly their own indulgence. She pretended not to notice. She went on as always, the hostess, the diplomat, the businesswoman whose elegance concealed her calculations. But something inside her had begun to shift. The noise of the hall, once a comfort, now rang faintly hollow. She found herself walking its corridors at odd hours, her slippers silent on the marble, her reflection following her in the mirrors like an old companion who no longer smiled. Perhaps it was success itself that wearied her. Wealth, she discovered, was not an arrival but a new kind of burden. A mirror polished so bright it showed every flaw. The more she possessed, the more she feared losing it. Even her laughter changed, quieter now, thoughtful. She had built an empire on pleasure, yet she found herself increasingly drawn to silence. It was around this time that she began to look westward. The city of New Orleans, for all its charm, was a cage of its own making. Her money, her notoriety, none of it could make her free of its judgments. And so, when a friend wrote from California describing a strange new business rising from the dust, a business of moving pictures, Lulu listened. The letter spoke of a place called Hollywood, just a few miles from Los Angeles, where dreamers and scoundrels alike were trying to capture light itself. It was madness, of course, but a kind of madness she recognized. For weeks, she pondered it. She would sit at her desk, a map spread before her, tracing the route with the tip of her pen. New Orleans to Galveston, Galveston to El Paso to California. She imagined the desert silence, the scent of eucalyptus in the wind, the newness of it all. To build something there, to plant her fortune in a soil untouched by the old world. What greater act of reinvention could there be? And so, in 1906, she packed her trunks. The city gossiped endlessly. Some said she was fleeing prosecution, others that she had been summoned by a film magnate who adored her. The truth was quieter. She simply wished to begin again. She left the hall in trusted hands, though no one could ever rule it as she did. When her train pulled away from the station, the city receded into mist. The river, that old companion, gleamed once more in the sunlight, and she wondered if it mourned her departure. The journey was long, the air dry, the landscape strange. In California, everything smelled different. sun-baked earth, sage, and something electric, as if the very light had a sharper edge. Hollywood was not yet the kingdom it would become. It was a scattering of houses and dusty lots where dreamers built stages from scrap wood and painted the desert sky into whatever color they required. Lulu felt both alien and at home. Here, she could be anyone. She met with men who called themselves producers, men who spoke of fortunes to be made from the flicker of light on white canvas. They promised her shares in studios that did not yet exist, contracts printed on paper so new the ink still smudged. She understood their hunger. It mirrored her own from years before, and for a time, she believed. She dined with them in hotels fragrant with orange blossoms, her laughter echoing across courtyards strung with lanterns. She imagined herself not as a madam, but as a patroness of art, a woman whose fortune might help birth a new empire of illusion. But dreams are delicate things in the heat. The man who had written to her, the one she trusted to secure her investment, vanished. Weeks passed without word. When she finally found him again, the studio he had promised her ownership of was gone, sold, transferred, dissolved in a labyrinth of legal trickery. Her name appeared nowhere. The papers she held were worthless. Betrayal, she discovered, has a particular taste when mixed with California dust. It is bitter and strangely dry, leaving no tears. She returned to her rented house that night and sat by the open window until dawn. The city around her was asleep, but she could hear faint laughter from the hills, the sound of men celebrating victories that were not hers. She thought then of Mahogany Hall, its polished railings, its mirrors, its music. She missed its certainty, its rhythm. For all its dangers, Storyville had never lied to her about what it was. By the time she returned to New Orleans months later, the city had changed again. Storyville was louder, brighter, almost feverish. Jazz had taken root fully now. The young musicians no longer played just for coin, but for something greater, a sound that belonged to the future. Lulu's absence had made her legend larger. When she stepped once more through the doors of Mahogany Hall, her girls stared as if they had seen a ghost. She said little of California. To some, she hinted at triumph. To others, she spoke of lessons learned. But in truth, she carried back more than disappointment. The failure had deepened her understanding of her own empire. The films she had almost owned were only another kind of illusion, no different from the one she crafted nightly in her parlors. Every dream, she realized, requires someone to play the audience. The hall resumed its rhythm, the lamps lit once more, the music swelling each evening like the tide. Yet something of the desert stayed with her, a sense of emptiness that even her jewels could not fill. On quiet nights, she would take one of the reels of blank film she had kept as a memento and hold it up to the light. The empty frames shimmered faintly, capturing nothing. Her friends noticed the change. She was quieter now, her laughter slower to come. Sometimes she would pause in conversation, her gaze drifting to a point beyond the room. "You can build a palace from shadows," she said once, "but you cannot live in it forever." Still, she carried on. There was gold to be made and guilt to be buried beneath it. The city continued to visit her doors, eager to forget itself in her rooms. And she continued to play her part, the hostess, the queen, the woman who seemed untouchable. Yet when the music stopped at the end of the night and the mirrors caught only her reflection, she felt the weight of it all. The gold and the guilt, twin chains that glittered too beautifully to cast off. The last candle flickered. Somewhere beyond the shutters, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of the river again. She closed her eyes, imagining its waters reaching all the way to California, erasing footprints no one else remembered. Tomorrow, the papers would speak of new laws, new restrictions, new storms gathering. But for now, the city slept, and Lulu, surrounded by silence, began to wonder how long her empire could hold before the flood came. The flood that Lulu feared did not come with water, but with whispers, rumors that drifted through parlors and papers, carried by men in uniforms and women in lace gloves. They spoke of unrest in Europe, of kings and assassins, of distant alliances tightening like ropes. It all seemed impossibly far from Basin Street, yet the air itself had changed. The music in Mahogany Hall grew more urgent, as though the city's heart had begun to race without knowing why. Lulu first heard the word war from a guest who had come down from New York, a shipping magnate, his fingers heavy with rings, his laughter brittle. He spoke of the markets trembling, of letters arriving with seals from London, of sons already being fitted for uniforms. When he left, he forgot his cane by the piano, and Lulu found herself staring at it long after he was gone. A slender piece of ebony capped with gold, its surface gleaming like the handle of fate itself. New Orleans, ever hungry for distraction, carried on. The city still danced, still drank, still sinned in rhythm. But beneath the laughter, something restless stirred. Ships in the harbor grew more numerous. Soldiers began appearing in the taverns, their accents from places Lulu had never heard of. Even the riverboats seemed to move differently, heavier, slower, as if burdened by unseen cargo. She felt it too, that strange tightening of time. The nights in Mahogany Hall stretched longer, the mornings shorter. Her guests spoke less of pleasure now and more of escape. The sound of jazz deepened, acquiring an ache it had not known before. Jelly Roll had moved north by then, and others followed, drawn to Chicago, to New York, to the promise of stages where their music might outlive the walls of Storyville. Lulu watched them go one by one, her pride tinged with sorrow. The hall grew quieter without them. One humid evening, she sat by the open window of her study, listening to the rain. The city lights blurred through the glass, each one trembling like a candle. On her desk lay a newspaper folded to an article about the assassination of an Austrian archduke. The words meant little to her, but the tone, the inevitability of it, felt familiar. Change, she had learned, never arrived gently. Downstairs, the musicians were still playing, though fewer guests had come. The piano drifted through the walls like a heartbeat. Lulu rose, smoothed her dress, and went to them. The air in the parlor was warm and smelled faintly of brandy and lilies. A young man was at the piano, his hands uncertain but earnest. She listened until the song ended, then approached him. "Play something for yourself," she said. He hesitated. "For myself, madame?" "Yes, not for them. For you." He looked down at the keys, then began again, softly at first, then stronger. It was a melody she didn't recognize, something slow and full of yearning. When it ended, she placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "Remember that feeling," she said. "That's what the world will forget when the war comes." The boy looked up at her, confused. "Do you think it will come here?" Lulu smiled faintly. "Everything comes here eventually, even what we don't invite." Outside, thunder rolled across the river, though the rain had stopped. She stood for a while at the parlor door, watching the lightning flicker over the rooftops. Each flash illuminated the street for an instant. Wet cobblestones, shuttered windows, the silhouettes of carriages hurrying home. Then darkness again. Within a year, the war had swallowed Europe, and though the fighting was an ocean away, its echoes reached even New Orleans. Ships were requisitioned, prices rose, and letters from abroad began arriving edged in black. Mahogany Hall's clientele shifted. More uniforms now, fewer familiar faces. Sailors came with wide eyes and heavy wallets, their laughter louder, their grief nearer to the surface. Lulu treated them with unexpected gentleness. She saw in their faces the same hunger she had known as a girl, the need to forget what the world demanded of them. Still, the city watched her more closely. Morality committees grew bolder. Politicians spoke again of reform. The word Storyville appeared in print with increasing venom, a stain upon the city's conscience. Yet at night, the same officials who denounced her sent their carriages to her door. Lulu received them with her usual grace, her diamond smile unbroken. But in private, she began to prepare. She converted her profits to gold when she could, hid some beneath the floorboards of her study, sent the rest quietly to a bank in Havana. She did not trust laws, but she trusted the ocean. It never judged, only carried what it was given. The girls who worked for her noticed her new silence. She no longer lingered at the piano, no longer laughed as she once did. Her beauty remained, but it had sharpened into something almost solemn. One night, after the last guests had gone, she climbed to the roof. The city stretched out before her in a patchwork of light and darkness. From here, she could see the faint glow of ships anchored along the river, their funnels exhaling smoke into the night. Somewhere down there, men were leaving for war. The thought brought an ache she could not name. She wondered if any of them would remember the sound of Mahogany Hall, the warmth of its lights, the laughter that had once filled its rooms. She leaned against the railing, feeling the wind rise from the river, thick and heavy with rain. Below her, a saxophone began to play, a slow, haunting melody that seemed to climb the walls and reach for her like a memory. She closed her eyes, letting it wash over her. It was then she realized how fragile everything truly was. The music, the wealth, even the walls she had built so carefully. The city was changing again, and this time she could not charm it into stillness. A drop of rain struck her cheek, then another. She tilted her face upward, letting the storm find her. The wind caught the hem of her gown, the fabric clinging to her skin. For a moment, she looked less like a queen than a woman baptized by her own creation. When she descended the stairs again, the lamps were flickering. The hall smelled of ozone and roses. The last note of the saxophone still hung in the air, trembling like the final breath of a dream. She stood in the doorway of the parlor and whispered, almost to herself, "Let them dance a little longer." And so they did. The next morning, the papers reported that American ships were mobilizing, that the president had promised to keep the nation neutral. Lulu read the headlines with calm indifference. She knew promises were just words dressed in uniform. The world was already moving toward its next act, and soon enough, Storyville would feel the pull. She folded the newspaper and placed it beside the gold-tipped cane the magnate had left behind years ago. The two gleamed side by side in the sunlight, symbols of wealth and warning. Outside, a breeze carried the faint scent of the river into the room. Somewhere a trumpet began to play, low and slow. It sounded like farewell. That trumpet playing farewell drifted down Basin Street until it met the heavy air of the river and vanished. Its echo clung faintly to the morning fog as though refusing to be forgotten. Lulu stood by the window, her hand resting on the frame, watching the city through the veil of mist. It was 1917 now, and the world was unraveling faster than even rumor could keep up. America had entered the war, and with it came new orders, new purities, and new fears. The soldiers stationed near the port were told to fight for decency as well as victory, and someone in Washington had decided that decency began with the closing of Storyville. The decree arrived like a gust of cold wind through a half-open door. It came not from the city, but from the Secretary of War himself, carried in the form of a letter heavy with seals and signatures. Lulu read it twice, the words dry and bureaucratic. To prevent distraction and moral decay among the armed forces, all establishments of ill repute within designated proximity to naval operations shall be closed immediately. There it was, the end of an era hidden in polite phrasing. She folded the letter carefully, placed it on her desk, and poured herself a glass of cognac. Outside, the street was already waking to the news. The girls gathered at the balconies, their shawls drawn tight around their shoulders, whispering to one another. The piano downstairs tried to carry on, the same cheerful tune it played each morning, but even the notes seemed thinner now, more uncertain. Lulu did not panic. She had always known that everything she built existed on borrowed time. Yet as she walked through Mahogany Hall that morning, the familiar scent of polish and perfume seemed different, too sweet, almost unbearable. The mirrors caught her reflection and multiplied it until the room was full of her, each face calm, composed, resigned. She had imagined this moment many times, the closing of doors, the silence after the music. She had thought she would meet it with indifference, but indifference was a myth, she discovered, reserved for those who had nothing left to lose. By noon, a policeman appeared at her door. He was polite, almost apologetic, his hat clutched in his hands. "Madam White," he said, "you understand we have our orders. All houses are to be vacated within 72 hours. Lulu nodded. "I understand." He hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the staircase, the faint glimmer of chandeliers. "It's a fine place," he said softly. "It was," Lulu replied and closed the door behind him. The next days passed like the slow dismantling of a dream. The furniture was covered with sheets, the lamps extinguished one by one. The girls packed their trunks, their laughter forced, their eyes uncertain. Some wept quietly. Others made plans for new beginnings in other cities, Chicago, New York, Havana. Lulu helped them where she could, pressing folded bills into their hands, offering names and addresses of those who might help. "Keep your head high," she told them. "Never apologize for having lived." At night, when the hall grew silent, she wandered through the rooms alone. The sound of her footsteps echoed softly against the marble, a lonely metronome counting down the hours. The piano in the parlor was closed now, the keys hidden beneath its lid like secrets too painful to retell. Sometimes she would pause beside it, her fingers tracing the smooth wood. She could almost hear the ghost of a melody beneath her touch, the laughter, the music, the rhythm of what once was. On the final evening, she held one last gathering, not a celebration, not quite a farewell, but something in between. The remaining musicians came, uninvited but welcome. They played without audience or restraint, their music filling the hall one last time, rising up to the high ceilings like prayer. Lulu sat in her favorite chair near the fireplace, her gown a deep shade of violet, her diamonds subdued beneath the flicker of the lamps. She listened as they played until the night became a single, unbroken note of longing. When the music ended, there was silence so profound it felt like a living thing. Lulu rose, her voice steady. "Leave the doors open," she said. "Let the night have what it's owed." The musicians nodded and slipped out into the dark, their instruments tucked beneath their arms. The sound of their footsteps faded down Basin Street, swallowed by the fog. Lulu remained behind, standing at the base of the staircase. The hall was empty now. The air carried the faint scent of roses left too long in their vases. She climbed the stairs slowly, her hand gliding along the polished rail. In her room, she removed her jewelry, piece by piece, and placed it on the vanity. The tiara, the rings, the necklaces, all the symbols of her reign lay in quiet surrender upon the table. She studied her reflection in the mirror. The woman who gazed back at her seemed older, yes, but also freer. The crown had been heavy, its loss strangely light. At dawn, she descended one last time. The light spilled through the windows, pale and indifferent. Dust already gathered on the floors where hundreds had danced. She opened the doors herself and stepped into the street. The air was cool, carrying the smell of the river and the distant cry of gulls. Across the way, another madam was sweeping her steps, her face hidden by a veil. They nodded to each other, a silent acknowledgement between two queens at the end of their reigns. Lulu turned back to look at Mahogany Hall. The morning sun struck the facade, and for a moment it glowed as it had on the day it was built, warm, luminous, alive. Then a shadow passed, and the illusion was gone. The building would not stay empty for long. Within a few years, it would be sold for a fraction of what it had cost to build, its marble scuffed, its mirrors shattered. A shopkeeper would use its grand parlor as storage, unaware of the history his boxes concealed. But on that morning in 1917, it still belonged to her, if only in memory. She walked away without looking back. Her steps were steady, her head high. The streets of Storyville were eerily quiet, the usual music replaced by the creak of shutters closing, the distant sound of hammers boarding up windows. The world was moving on, and she would have to move with it. As she reached the corner, she paused, the wind tugging gently at her hair. From somewhere far behind her came a faint sound, a single chord struck on a piano. She turned, but the street was empty. Perhaps it was her imagination. Perhaps it was the hall itself saying goodbye. She smiled, a small, private smile, and continued walking until the sound faded completely. The city would forget her soon enough, she knew. But there are some buildings that remember the touch of the hands that built them, and some nights that refuse to end entirely. That evening, as the last light disappeared over the river, the windows of Mahogany Hall caught the sunset one final time, burning crimson before surrendering to dusk. And somewhere within that fading light, if one listened closely, there was still music, soft, distant, and unending. The echo of that last chord from Mahogany Hall followed her long after she walked away. For days afterward, she would wake with the sound, still humming somewhere between dream and memory. A vibration rather than a tune, a reminder of something that had ended too quietly to be mourned aloud. Storyville itself seemed to fall into that same silence. Basin Street, once so alive with music and color, now stood half abandoned, its shutters drawn, its lamps darkened. The laughter that had once drifted through its windows had been replaced by the dull clatter of cartwheels and the low murmur of the soldiers who still lingered at the port, waiting to leave for Europe. Lulu moved through these streets like a ghost of her former life. The hall was gone from her, yet its rhythm pulsed faintly beneath her skin. She still dressed beautifully, still held her head high, but something in her walk had changed. Her heels struck the cobblestones slower. Her glances lingered longer on doorways that used to glow with candlelight. She was no longer the diamond queen of Basin Street, just a woman with fine clothes and a past that hung around her like perfume, too rich to forget, too heavy to escape. She took rooms for a time at a small boarding house near Bienville Street, where the air smelled of coffee and stale tobacco. The other tenants, shop clerks, musicians, and widows, greeted her politely but never by name. They did not need to. Everyone knew who she had been, and those who pretended not to know did so out of respect or discomfort. At night, she sat by the window, a glass of brandy in her hand, watching the city's faint glow reflect on the water. It was during those quiet weeks that she began to notice the new kind of noise that had replaced the old. It was not music, nor the laughter of the streets, but the metallic growl of machines. Automobiles had begun to appear, slow, proud beasts that rattled the cobblestones and filled the air with the smell of gasoline. They were symbols of a world moving forward, of an age that no longer cared for the softness of candlelight or the elegance of waltzes. The future, Lulu thought, had no patience for velvet, but the past clings even when uninvited. One afternoon, she walked down Basin Street, unable to resist seeing what had become of her old home. The doors of Mahogany Hall were bolted shut, the windows clouded with dust. A sign had been nailed crookedly to the frame, "For sale." The letters were faded, the corners of the sign curled from rain. She stood there for a long time, one gloved hand resting against the iron railing. The marble steps were streaked with dirt, the brass fixtures dull. The building had aged in months what most took years to decay. A man passing by stopped to look at her. "You knew the woman who owned this place?" he asked casually, not recognizing her. Lulu smiled faintly. "Once," she said. "Shame what happened," he went on. "They say she was quite something, a real lady for a madam." Lulu inclined her head. "Yes," she murmured, "for a madam." Then she walked away before he could speak again. That evening, she lit a small candle in her boarding house room and placed it by the window. The light flickered weakly against the glass, a gesture too small to matter and yet too necessary to omit. It was her way of keeping vigil, not for the hall, but for the time it had represented. The months slipped by in this strange half-life. The war overseas deepened, then ended, and the world celebrated while Storyville remained shuttered. New Orleans reinvented itself, as it always did, but the reinvention left no place for her. The brothels that had survived moved underground, their glamour replaced by secrecy. Lulu might have followed that path, but she found herself weary of hidden doors. She opened instead a small saloon on Bienville Street, a place less adorned, less demanding. She named it simply Lulu's, as if to test whether her name still carried weight. The regulars were different now. Dock workers, gamblers, the occasional musician who remembered the old days. They came for whiskey and conversation, not spectacle. The piano in the corner was out of tune, but sometimes, late at night, one of the patrons would coax a melody from it, and for a moment the room would come alive again. Lulu would sit behind the bar, smiling faintly, her hands folded before her. She was older, yes, but still beautiful in that way that time could not erase, like a painting whose colors had darkened, but not dimmed. Yet she felt the emptiness growing around her. The luxury she had once known was gone. Her gowns began to fray at the seams. Her jewels remained locked away, untouched. The laughter of her patrons was rougher, their stories less romantic. There were no carriages now waiting outside at dawn, only the sound of bottles clinking and chairs scraping against the wooden floor. And still, she endured. It was during one of those slow evenings that she realized how quiet her heart had become. Not broken, just quiet like a clock that still keeps time but no longer chimes the hour. She poured herself a drink, raised it slightly toward the ceiling, and said softly, "To the hollow years." The toast was private, almost tender. Sometimes she thought of leaving again, perhaps to California or to Havana where the music never ceased. But the thought passed as quickly as it came. She belonged to New Orleans, to its damp air and fading grandeur. To leave it would be to erase herself. There were rumors now of prohibition, of new laws that would come for the saloons as they had come for the brothels. She read the newspapers with a detached calm, already knowing how the story would end. The government had a talent for mistaking human need for sin, and every closing door only opened another in shadow. On the last night of that year, Lulu closed the saloon early. She locked the front door and sat alone at one of the tables. Outside, fireworks burst faintly over the river, their colors muted by distance. She could hear the city cheering, celebrating peace, invention, progress. She smiled sadly at the irony. She poured herself a final glass, the brandy catching the light like molten gold. As she raised it, she caught her reflection in the dark window. An older woman, poised and solitary, the faintest trace of laughter still at the corners of her mouth. "Everything ends," she whispered, "even music." The candle by the bar flickered, then went out. In the quiet that followed, the sound of the river crept faintly through the cracks in the window, steady and low, a reminder that even in the hollow years, the current still moved, carrying with it all that once had shimmered and now was gone. The river's slow whisper outside her window gave no comfort that winter. The water carried new names now: prohibition, temperance, reform, words spoken with the same false virtue that had silenced Storyville. Lulu read them in the morning papers, the print smudged by her thumb, and smiled without amusement. It was 1920, and the nation had decided that liquor, like pleasure, was the root of its decay. The saloons were to close, the barrels emptied, the spirits banished. She had seen such bans before, had watched them drive the poor into secrecy and the powerful into hypocrisy. She knew better than anyone that outlawing desire never extinguished it. It only changed the price. Her little place on Bienville Street, once half forgotten and ordinary, now drew more visitors than it had in years. Men arrived at the door with cautious knocks, their collars turned up against the rain. Inside, the lights were low and the talk quieter. Lulu had replaced the whiskey with tonic. the rum with herbal syrups, and though the bottles bore innocent names, the scent that drifted through the room told the truth. She poured with the same grace she once had as a hostess, each glass filled with a secret that glittered faintly in the lamplight. Outside, agents patrolled in their dark coats, the law wrapped in self-righteousness. The newspapers called them prohibition men. But the city had other names for them: ghosts, pests, extortionists. They knew who to arrest and who to leave untouched. Lulu understood that game too. She had played it long before in a different costume. So she paid what was needed in money or in charm, and the ghosts passed her door in silence. But prohibition did more than fill her pockets. It filled the air with a new kind of loneliness. The music had changed. Jazz, once confined to the parlor in the street corner, now traveled northward, finding its home in Chicago and New York, where the laws were as cruel but the money louder. The young players who had once begged to play in Mahogany Hall were gone, their names beginning to appear on record sleeves. Lulu listened to them sometimes, the crackling phonograph turning memory into echo. She would close her eyes and imagine the hall alive again, the marble floors, the laughter, the scent of jasmine and gin. But when she opened her eyes, there was only the dim bar and the quiet faces of men who drank to forget their own ghosts. On certain nights, when the rain was heavy and no customers came, she went down to the cellar. The floor was lined with crates of soda water, each bottle filled with the amber liquid that had become her new trade. She worked alone, filling, sealing, labeling by hand. The rhythm of it reminded her of the music that once rose beneath the stairs, the soft clinking of glass, the faint hiss of corks, the heartbeat of defiance. Sometimes she thought of it as communion, a ritual shared between her and the spirits she served. Not just whiskey or rum, but the ghosts of every woman who had lived by her wits, every man who had come seeking warmth, every note of every song that had ever drifted through her walls. The police came twice that spring. The first time, they knocked politely. She greeted them with a smile, her eyes bright beneath her red wig. "This is a tea house," she said lightly. "Would you like to taste the blend?" The older officer coughed, uneasy, while the younger one flushed and removed his hat. They searched the shelves perfunctorily, lifted bottles, sniffed, found nothing they dared name, and left with a bow. The second visit was less kind. They came with noise and boots, overturning tables, smashing a few bottles for show. Lulu watched them calmly, her hands folded. When the senior officer found nothing worth confiscating, he turned to her with a small shrug. "You've grown clever, Miss White." "I had a good teacher," she said softly. "You call him the law." He smiled despite himself, tipped his hat, and left. When the door closed behind them, she exhaled slowly, the scent of spilled liquor rising like incense. The world outside was moving on, faster than she could follow. Automobiles multiplied, radios filled homes with distant voices, and women marched for rights she had taken for herself long ago. Yet Lulu felt no envy for their new freedoms. Freedom, she knew, was always rented, never owned. What she missed was not power, but the music, the pulse of life that had once filled the spaces between conversation and sin. Sometimes, after closing, she walked down to the river. The nights were cooler now, the air carrying the smell of oil and salt instead of magnolia. The ships were larger, their lights brighter, their whistles deeper. She stood on the levee, her shawl drawn tight, and watched the water slide past. "You and I," she whispered to it. "We never stay still long enough to be forgiven." The moonlight rippled across the surface, catching her reflection. An older face now, lined at the edges but still regal, her eyes dark and steady. She smiled faintly at the river's mimicry and turned away before she could mistake the shimmer for tears. One summer night, a former musician from the old district found her bar. He was older too, his hair touched with gray, his cornet battered but still capable of song. "Madame," he said, I thought you might want to hear how the city sounds now." He played right there in the corner, the notes trembling at first, then blooming into something tender and wild. The few customers in the room went silent. Lulu closed her eyes. The years fell away. The girls laughing, the pianos rising, the scent of smoke and wine. When he finished, she applauded quietly. "It's all still there," she whispered. "You just have to listen beneath the noise." The man smiled sadly. "And who listens now?" She looked toward the window where the rain tapped softly against the glass. "Those who remember," she said, "and the ghosts who never left." After he was gone, she sat for a long time, her hands resting on the counter. The lamps flickered, and the bottles glowed like amber jewels in their shadows. The world might have called her a criminal again, but she felt no shame. She had outlasted morality before and would again. Yet as the clock struck midnight, she felt the faintest tremor of weariness, a soft ache deep in her chest. It was not regret, she had no patience for that, but something gentler, a kind of homesickness for a world that no longer existed. She extinguished the lamps one by one, leaving only the faint light from the street. The bar fell into stillness. The scent of liquor lingered in the air, mingled with the faint sweetness of rain. As she turned the key in the lock, she thought she heard a faint sound from the cellar, a low hum, like a distant melody played on a forgotten horn. She paused, listening. The sound faded, replaced by the steady drip of water along the eaves. "Play on," she murmured again, echoing her own words from years before. "Play on, even in the dark." And with that, she stepped out into the wet night, the door closing softly behind her. The streets shimmered with rain, their reflections bending the light until everything, past, present, sin, survival, blurred into a single glistening stream flowing toward the unseen river. The rain that had followed her home that night did not stop for 3 days. It came in sheets, soaking the cobblestones until they gleamed like black mirrors. The river swelled, the gutters overflowed, and even the air inside Lulu's little saloon tasted faintly of rust and water. On the third morning, just as she was preparing to open the door, they came for her. 2 men in plain clothes, polite but firm, their boots dripping on the threshold. "Miss White," the taller one said, showing her a folded paper, "we're afraid there's been some complaint. Possession and sale of intoxicating spirits under the Volstead Act." Lulu looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled that same small smile she had perfected over a lifetime of pretending that nothing could surprise her. "Gentlemen," she said, "if you can find any spirits left in this place, I'd be obliged if you'd pour me a glass." They laughed, one reluctantly, the other not at all. She let them search. They upturned crates, pried at the floorboards, sniffed at bottles of tonic water and orange cordial. When they found what they needed, a single bottle tucked behind the piano, half full, unlabeled, she did not argue. She only nodded, as though confirming what she had long suspected. The time for small games was over. They took her quietly, without handcuffs, through streets slick with rain. The few passers-by who saw her might have thought she was merely out for an early errand, her shawl drawn against the cold. In the station, they wrote her name down as Lulu Hendley, alias Lulu White, age uncertain, occupation, proprietor. They did not ask her to explain herself. They did not need to. The city already had its story. In the back room, beneath a single buzzing light, a young officer raised a camera. The air smelled of damp paper and ink. "Look straight ahead, ma'am," he said. She did. The flash caught her by surprise, a brief explosion of white that left her blinking. When her vision cleared, he was already winding the film, his face expressionless. "Thank you," he murmured, as though she had just posed for a portrait rather than a record. Lulu remained seated a moment longer. The room was quiet but for the faint ticking of a clock. Somewhere beyond the door, rain drummed against the tin roof. She thought of all the photographs that had been taken of her over the years, the painted portraits, the newspaper sketches, the advertisements for Mahogany Hall. Each had been a version of herself she had chosen to reveal. This one, she realized, was different. It was not meant for admiration, but for evidence. Still, when the officer handed her the small mirror so she could fix her hair, she caught her reflection and almost laughed. Even now, her poise remained intact. The world could record her, but it could not define her. They held her overnight, more out of formality than vengeance. The other women in the cell recognized her at once. One whispered her name as though it were a spell. "That's her, the madam," she said, "the one with the diamonds." Lulu said nothing. She sat on the narrow cot, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. The walls smelled of mildew and regret. Somewhere down the hall, a woman coughed until it turned to laughter, then to silence. In the early hours, when even the guards had grown weary, Lulu closed her eyes. She dreamt not of Mahogany Hall, but of the fields of her childhood, the red earth after rain, the sound of cicadas. She saw herself as a girl again, barefoot walking down a dirt road toward the faint glimmer of a city she could not yet imagine. When she woke, the dream clung to her like the scent of old perfume, faint and bitter-sweet. By mid-morning, she was released. A small fine was paid, by whom she never learned. The rain had stopped, and the street steamed in the weak sunlight. She walked home alone, her shoes soaking through the puddles. The city moved around her indifferently. Automobiles hissed past, their horns sharp as accusations. She paused once before a shop window and saw her reflection staring back. Older, yes, the lines around her eyes deeper, but her expression the same as ever, composed, amused, defiant. The photograph would show only one version of her, she thought. The rest belonged to the city's memory, and to hers. When she reached the saloon, she found it empty but undisturbed. The tables were just as she had left them, the mirror behind the bar glimmering faintly with the last light of the day. She poured herself a drink from what remained, a small glass of gin, the last, perhaps, she would ever taste openly. She raised it to the mirror, to her reflection, to all the women she had been. To survival, she said softly, and drank. The next week, a copy of her mugshot appeared in a local gazette, tucked between notices of civic meetings and advertisements for patent medicine. The image was small, grainy, almost gentle. The caption read, "Former Basin Street Madam arrested for violation of prohibition law." But the photograph told another story. Her eyes met the camera with an odd serenity, a trace of irony in their depths. She looked not defeated, but aware that the world around her was merely performing another cycle of its endless theater. The regulars who still came to her bar joked quietly about it. "Madame's a celebrity again," one said, raising his glass. She smiled but did not reply. The laughter of others had ceased to matter to her long ago. She kept the clipping, folded it carefully, and placed it in the same box that held the old letters from California and the deeds to Mahogany Hall. On restless nights, she would take it out, unfold it, and study her own face. The eyes staring back seemed to belong to someone she had once known well, but could no longer name. Outside, the world spun faster. The decade was changing, the old giving way to the new. Radios sang in every home. Airplanes traced their white scars across the sky. The city, forever hungry, began to forget its past. Storyville's ruins were being paved over, its name reduced to a caution whispered to children. But sometimes, when a certain melody drifted from a passing car or a voice called her name by mistake, Lulu would smile. History, she knew, was not written in ink. It was written in echoes. One afternoon, as the sun sank low, she pinned her hair, put on a crimson dress, and stood before the mirror again. She looked at herself as if greeting an old adversary. "You're still here," she murmured. "Imagine that." Then she turned away, leaving the reflection to fade in the dimming light. Outside, the first street lamps flickered to life. their glow soft and uncertain. Somewhere beyond the city's rooftops, a trumpet began to play, a tune half familiar, half forgotten. She closed her eyes and listened. The music, fragile and distant, carried her back to a time before guilt and photographs, before laws written to tame desire. For a moment she could almost smell the polish of mahogany, hear the laughter beneath the stairs. She smiled, not sadly, but with quiet wonder. The world might have captured her image, but it could never contain her song. That faint trumpet that reached her through the evening fog still lingered in her mind the next morning, like a scent that refused to leave a room. It was not only music, it was memory made sound, and it stayed with her as she descended the narrow stairs of her lodging and stepped into the street. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still slick, and the air smelled of iron and magnolia. She felt the weight of her years in her bones, though her walk remained upright, her posture unbent. Time, she thought, could wrinkle a face but not a will. The papers had already stopped talking about her arrest. A new scandal had taken its place. Some politician or preacher found guilty of the same indulgences he had once condemned. Lulu smiled faintly as she read, the corner of her mouth curving like the echo of a forgotten song. Hypocrisy was an old tune, older than jazz, older even than the river. She folded the newspaper carefully and used it to light the morning fire. Life resumed, as it always did, but quieter now. Her bar on Bienville Street had become something of a sanctuary for those who preferred discretion to spectacle. There were no more crowds, no music loud enough to draw suspicion, only small gatherings of people who understood the art of silence. Bottles arrived through back doors, wrapped in paper, unlabeled but well known to the faithful few who came seeking comfort. Lulu served them herself. She was too cautious now to employ others. The fewer who knew the workings of her little trade, the safer it would remain. She had learned to move like smoke, seen but never caught. The suppliers trusted her. The officers, some of them, respected her for her calm dignity, her unshakable composure. Once or twice a month, a man in uniform stopped by after hours, pretending to check on a disturbance. She would pour him a glass without a word, and he would drink it slowly, staring at the amber surface as if it held his reflection. When he left, he always tipped his hat and said, "Good night, Miss White." It was their ritual, his pretense, her protection. But not all ghosts could be bought. Some came uninvited. Late one evening, after closing, she descended to the cellar to count her remaining stock. The air was cool and damp, the faint scent of yeast rising from the barrels. Her lantern cast long shadows against the walls, where spider webs shivered like silk veils. As she worked, she thought she heard footsteps above her, soft, deliberate, unmistakable. She froze, her hand resting on the corked bottle before her. Then came a voice, low, familiar, calling her name. "Lulu!" She turned sharply, but there was no one there. Only the quiet creak of the floorboards and the dripping of rainwater through the old pipes. Still, the voice had been real. She knew it as surely as she knew the smell of her own perfume. It was the past, knocking gently on her door. When she returned upstairs, she poured herself a small drink and sat by the window. The city outside was wrapped in fog, the lamps along the street glowing like half-buried stars. She thought of all the voices she had heard in her lifetime, laughter, pleading, music, and how they had faded one by one, leaving her with only the hum of the city itself. Perhaps that was what haunted her most, not ghosts of people, but ghosts of moments. The years after her arrest blurred into one another. The world above her head changed shape. Cars replaced carriages, radios replaced street musicians. People spoke of prosperity now, of the jazz age, though the music that had been born in her hall was now played in places she would never see. She listened sometimes to the radio when her neighbors turned it up loud enough. She would catch fragments of the new songs, faster, brighter, more daring than before, and she would smile. The rhythm was the same, only the tempo had changed. Her own rhythm slowed. The nights grew longer, the mornings harder to rise into. She took to walking less, preferring to sit behind her bar, her hands folded neatly before her, her gaze distant. The regulars noticed but said nothing. They knew she was a woman of silences. Then, one evening, a stranger came. He was young, no older than 20, his suit too fine for his age, his hair slick with pomade. He ordered a glass of the house tonic and drank it too quickly, his face lighting with surprise. "This is good," he said. "Where do you get it?" "From friends," Lulu replied, her tone soft. "You ever think of selling it beyond this street? People up north would pay real money for a drink like this." She smiled faintly. "People up north already pay for it. They just don't know my name is on it." The boy blinked, unsure whether she was joking. "You must have been something once." "I still am something," she said gently. "Just something smaller." He left after one more drink, promising to return, though he never did. Youth, she thought, never keeps its promises. That night, she took her ledger from the drawer and ran her fingers over the fading ink. The numbers told a story not of profit, but of persistence. She no longer sought wealth. Her trade had become a habit, a ritual, a way of keeping time. The law called it bootlegging, but to her it was resurrection. Each bottle a whisper of the life that had been taken from her, each sale a small defiance. As the months passed, rumors began to reach her of raids in other quarters, of old madams and saloon owners dragged to court, of names she recognized printed in the papers for the last time. She knew her turn might come again, yet she no longer feared it. What could they take from her that the years had not already claimed? She dreamed often of the river now. In her dreams it was wider than before, black and endless, carrying music instead of water. On its surface floated lights, dozens of them, each a memory of a face she had once known. When she woke, she would lie still, listening for the faint sound of water against the levee. One evening, near the end of the decade, she closed early. The sky was heavy with clouds, the air still. She poured herself a final glass and sat before the mirror behind the bar. The reflection that stared back at her was softer now, blurred slightly by the glass and the smoke. She lifted the drink in a silent toast. "To the ghosts," she said, "to those who stayed." The wind rose outside, rattling the shutters. Somewhere down the street, a siren wailed, then faded. She drank slowly, the warmth spreading through her chest. For a moment she thought she saw movement in the mirror, a flicker of light, a shape behind her shoulder, the shimmer of a red gown like the one she had worn the night Mahogany Hall first opened. She turned, but the room was empty. Only the smell of whiskey lingered, old and familiar. Lulu smiled. "Play on," she whispered again. "Play on." Outside, thunder rolled across the river, and the first drops of rain began to fall, steady and cold, washing the city clean for yet another night of forgetting. The rain that had swept across the city that night washed everything in silver. Drops traced the window panes of Lulu's saloon like slow tears, distorting the world outside into ripples of light and shadow. She sat in her usual place behind the bar, the lamp beside her burning low, its flame bent by the draft that slid beneath the door. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and gin. In the half-light, she could almost imagine she was back inside Mahogany Hall, waiting for the first guests of the evening to arrive. But no one came anymore, not at this hour, not to this quiet corner of New Orleans, where time itself seemed reluctant to pass. She closed her eyes and let her mind drift. The sound of rain became the hush of distant applause. The lamp's flicker became the shimmer of chandeliers. For a fleeting moment, she could almost hear music again. The low hum of a trumpet, the brush of fingers across piano keys, the rise and fall of voices carried upward like smoke. Siwa, then it faded, leaving only the faint rattle of the shutters and the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Years had passed unnoticed. The faces that had once filled her rooms had long since disappeared into history, and Lulu herself had become little more than a rumor, a name that belonged to another time, another city. The papers no longer spoke of her, not even with derision. The young men who drank in the new clubs uptown had never heard of Mahogany Hall. To them, the past began and ended with the sound of their own generation. But there were still a few who remembered, and sometimes when they passed her narrow doorway, they would pause, nod, and whisper softly, "That's her." It was enough. Legends, after all, did not need an audience. They only needed to be believed in by a few. That spring, a rumor began to circulate among the old residents of Storyville that Lulu White had died. The story changed with each telling. Some said she had passed quietly in her sleep, her fortune hidden away in some forgotten bank. Others claimed she had been found alone, the last candle burned to its wick, her hands folded neatly across her chest. Still others swore they had seen her boarding a train bound for Florida, or perhaps Havana, or even Paris, where she intended to begin anew. The truth, as ever, remained elusive. The city loved her too much to let her end be ordinary. In the years that followed, the stories multiplied. A seamstress swore that she had once sewn a dress for Lulu and had received payment in gold coins so bright they hurt her eyes. A banker's clerk claimed a woman resembling her had withdrawn a large sum of money from a private account as late as 1941. And sometimes, late at night, old musicians said they still heard her voice drifting down Basin Street when the fog was thick. A low laugh, a snatch of melody, a whisper that vanished when you turned your head. Lulu herself heard these stories, though she no longer corrected them. She let the city invent whatever ending it pleased. To live long enough to become your own myth was its own kind of immortality. The truth, she knew, was simpler. She was tired. The mirror no longer flattered. The nights no longer promised anything new. She had made peace with her ghosts. There were days now when she did not open the bar at all. She would sit instead by the window of her small apartment above it, the curtains half drawn, watching the life below her unfold at a gentler pace. The children who played in the street had never known Storyville. Their laughter was free of the world's old judgments. The city had changed again. Automobiles now filled the avenues, the riverfront bristled with steel cranes, and electric lights burned brighter than any candle. But the scent of jasmine still clung to the night, and the sound of jazz, though faster, louder, brasher, was still the same heartbeat she had once known. It comforted her. One evening she took a small wooden box from the cupboard. Inside were the fragments of a life, the deed to Mahogany Hall, yellowed at the edges, a strand of pearls, their luster dimmed, a folded newspaper clipping bearing her mugshot, and a photograph taken many years earlier of her standing in front of the hall in its glory, her smile caught between pride and disbelief. She looked at the picture for a long while, then placed it face down as though closing a book. It was late when she blew out the lamp. The city beyond her window was a haze of light and shadow. Somewhere far away, perhaps down by the river, a trumpet began to play. A melody she recognized, though she could not remember from where. She rose, walked to the window, and opened it. The air was cool and smelled of rain. The music grew clearer, rising and falling in waves. For a moment, she could almost see it. The glow of her old hall, the swirl of silk dresses, the laughter that once filled every corner. She closed her eyes and let the sound carry her. When dawn came, the lamp on her table was still unlit, the window still open. The wind stirred the lace curtain, lifting it gently as if in farewell. The chair where she had sat was empty, though the glass beside it still held the faint print of her fingers. The landlord who came later that morning found the room untouched, her belongings neatly arranged. On the table lay the wooden box, the photograph placed atop it once more. Face up now, the edges curling softly in the damp air. He took it as proof that she had gone peacefully. The city would take it as proof that she had not gone at all. That summer, people began to say that Basin Street was haunted again. A woman in a red gown had been seen standing at the corner near the old site of Mahogany Hall, her figure luminous in the fog. She never spoke, they said, only smiled faintly when someone passed. Some claimed that, if you listened closely, you could hear a soft melody following her steps, a tune half jazz, half prayer. No one ever proved it, of course. But late one night, when the river breeze carried the sound of distant horns through the quarter, an old pianist sitting in a dim cafe paused, his fingers frozen above the keys. "That's her," he whispered. "That's Lulu. She's walking again." And for a moment, the city seemed to listen. The lamps flickered, the fog stirred, and down near the river, where the old district had once pulsed with life, the faint sound of laughter, familiar, elegant, defiant, rose and vanished into the night. Some say she died in 1931. Others swear she lived on quietly, long enough to see the world forget her name. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere between those stories, in the space where memory meets myth. Perhaps Lulu White never truly left at all. Perhaps even now, when the fog drifts in from the river and the music swells from unseen corners, she is there still, smiling beneath the lamplight, the diamond queen of the forgotten city, waiting for the next song to begin. The fog that carried her name down Basin Street never truly lifted. It became part of the air itself, woven into the pulse of the city, like perfume that lingers long after its wearer has gone. Even years later, when the old neighborhood had been paved over and its brothels replaced by warehouses and offices. There were nights when a cab driver swore he saw lights glowing where no building stood, or a musician, packing up his instrument after a late set, would catch the scent of lilac and whiskey on the wind and feel, inexplicably, that someone was listening. Mahogany Hall, that palace of silk and sin, did not last long after its mistress vanished. The building stood neglected for a decade, its doors nailed shut, its balconies rusting. Children dared each other to sneak inside, whispering that the mirrors still reflected the people who had danced there, even though the rooms were empty. When the wrecking crews came in 1949, the foreman paused before striking the first wall. "Feels wrong," he muttered, wiping his brow. "Like knocking down a church." The men laughed uneasily, then set to work. The marble staircase came down first, splintering into dust, but one of the workmen swore afterward that he heard a faint note rise as it fell, like a single chord from an invisible piano. The rubble was cleared away in silence, the land repurposed for something forgettable. Yet even after it was gone, people avoided walking there after dark. "That ground remembers," the older residents said. And perhaps it did, for New Orleans has always been a city that refuses to bury its dead too deeply. Its history hums beneath its cobblestones, restless and rhythmic. For a time, Lulu White existed only in the whispered recollections of those who had known her, or who claimed they had. Bartenders told tales of her wit. Musicians swore she had once saved their lives. In the jazz clubs that replaced the parlor houses, her name was spoken with both reverence and disbelief, as if she had been less a woman and more a legend born of smoke and song. There were even those who insisted she had been the true mother of Storyville, that without her, the district would have burned out in chaos instead of glowing for those brief, bright decades. Still, the city moved forward, as cities must. The young no longer spoke her name. They had their own idols now, their own ghosts to worship. Yet every so often a stranger would come to town, a writer, perhaps, or a historian, and begin asking questions. Who was she, really? What did she look like? Did she die poor or rich, forgotten or free? The old men at the bars would shrug. The old women would smile, and someone would always say, "Depends on which Lulu you're talking about, the one who lived or the one who never died." In 1955, an archivist at the city library stumbled upon a small box of records mislabeled property assessments, 1912 to 1918. Inside was a folder marked White L's Mahogany Hall. It contained letters, faded receipts, and one photograph, her mug shot from 1920. The archivist, a quiet man who had never set foot in a dance hall, found himself staring at it longer than he intended. Her gaze, even grainy and smudged, held something beyond the frame, a composure that seemed to belong to no time at all. He placed the photo carefully back into the folder, closed the box, and, for reasons he could not name, wrote in the margin, "Preserve indefinitely." That was how her face returned to the world. The image was printed in a local magazine decades later, beneath an article titled "Queens of Storyville." The caption beneath her photograph read, "Lulu White, Madam, Entrepreneur, and Enigma." No one could agree on the details of her life, but everyone agreed on one thing. She had ruled New Orleans in her time as surely as any mayor or magnate. The article rekindled something in the city's collective memory. A few of the older musicians still living in Treme swore that the rhythm of the early jazz standards, especially the melancholy ones, had been born in Mahogany Hall. "You can't hear it on record," one trumpeter said. "It's in the pause right before the note. That's her." Others claimed that Louis Armstrong's Mahogany Hall Stomp, recorded years after her death, carried her spirit note for note. Whether he meant to or not, the boy who had once stood outside her window listening had turned her name into melody. By the 1960s, when Storyville had become the subject of songs and films, her legend grew wilder still. Writers imagined her as everything: a saint of sin, a sorceress of pleasure, a tragic queen undone by time. The real woman vanished beneath the versions that came after her, yet perhaps she would have smiled at that. She had always understood that truth, like beauty, was more useful when slightly exaggerated. In certain circles, people began to speak of reviving her hall, not as a brothel, but as a music club, a temple to the sound she had helped birth. It never happened. The plans fell apart in meetings and paperwork, but the idea remained. Even now, a century later, the space where her hall once stood draws musicians who set up their horns and play to no one, just to hear how the echoes respond. Sometimes, when the night is thick with mist and the lights from the river bend through the fog, passers-by swear they hear music from beneath the ground, a faint rhythm rising through the stones, the ghost of a band tuning up for a crowd that no longer exists. And always, among the notes, there's a single voice, low, amused, commanding. "Play it slower," it says. "Make them listen." Those who have heard it never doubt who it is. Lulu's story, like the city itself, refuses to end neatly. The records remain incomplete, the testimonies conflicting. Some historians still search for proof that she died in 1931, pointing to an obituary for a Mrs. L. Hendley, buried in St. Louis Cemetery, No. 2. Others hold fast to the tale of the banker's witness, the woman who withdrew a fortune in 1941, her handwriting as elegant as ever. No grave has ever been confirmed. No will was found. It is as if she chose to vanish, not out of despair, but out of design, to slip quietly from the frame and leave the legend to speak for her. And so, when the summer rains roll in from the Gulf and the air turns heavy with magnolia and salt, some say she walks again along the riverfront, her footsteps soft against the stones, her reflection rippling beside her in the dark water. The barges moan as they pass, the wind carries the scent of whiskey, and the city, ever restless, ever listening, seems to pause for a heartbeat, as though waiting for her to speak. But she says nothing. She never did waste words when silence could do the work instead. The river continues its slow song. Somewhere in the quarter, a trumpet picks up the melody, uncertain but brave. And above it all, unseen but certain, the echo of mahogany answers, still rich, still human, still impossibly alive. The river has always kept its own counsel. It carries memory the way it carries silt. slowly, silently, folding one story over another until the truth settles deep beneath the surface. By the time the century turned again, few in New Orleans could recall the shape of Mahogany Hall or the woman who once ruled it. The tourists who walked Basin Street heard only fragments, a name whispered by a guide, a melody played by a street band. To them, Lulu White was not a person, but an atmosphere. A perfume that had evaporated yet somehow still perfumed the air. But the river, older than every city and every sin, remembered. It remembered the night she arrived, a young girl with a single suitcase and the look of someone who had already decided to outlive the world's judgment. It remembered her laughter echoing across its waters when Mahogany Hall was new, the sound of champagne corks and piano keys mingling with a low hum of steamboats. And it remembered the silence that followed when her lights went dark, the hush that settled over Storyville like fog after fire. The city might have paved over the past, but the current carried her name still, whispering it to the docks, to the gulls, to the reeds that swayed along the levee. Those who lived close to the river spoke of strange things in those years. They said that on quiet nights when the tide was low and the moon full, a figure could be seen walking along the water's edge, a woman dressed in red, her reflection rippling like smoke. She never looked up, never spoke, only walked slowly, her face turned toward the dark horizon. The fishermen called her La Dame Rouge, the Red Lady, and they left offerings for her, coins, bottles of rum, handfuls of jasmine, believing she was a guardian spirit of the river, or perhaps a lost soul seeking her hall once more. It is tempting, in the comfort of the modern age, to dismiss such tales as fancy. Yet there are moments when even the most rational mind feels the tug of the unseen. A trumpeter playing for tourists might find his melody bending unbidden into an older tune, one he never learned but somehow knows. A woman passing through the quarter might catch the scent of roses and mahogany on a street where no flowers grow. And in those moments, when the air grows still and the city seems to hold its breath, even the skeptics will glance toward the river and wonder whose song they are hearing. The few who still remembered her personally were old now, their voices softened by age. One of them, a pianist named Armand, who had once played for her, lived in a narrow house on Esplanade Avenue. He had lost most of his sight, but not his memory. She was no saint, he would tell those who asked, his hands resting on the yellowed keys of his piano. But she knew beauty when she saw it. That was her gift. She could take a room full of sorrow and make it shine like gold. He would play then, a slow, deliberate tune, the rhythm steady as footsteps descending a staircase. The notes hung in the air long after he finished. "That's her walk," he'd say, smiling faintly. "You could always hear her coming before you saw her." Armand died in the winter of 1959, the same year a small jazz club opened just a few streets from where Mahogany Hall once stood. The owner, unaware of the coincidence, named it the Basin. The opening night was crowded, the air thick with smoke and anticipation. When the first set began, the trumpeter chose to start with Mahogany Hall Stomp. The sound rolled through the room, bright and rough-edged, like laughter through tears. For a brief moment, the walls seemed to shimmer, as though they remembered. The patrons clapped and shouted, but the older musicians fell silent, exchanging glances. One of them swore later that he'd seen a figure standing near the back, half in shadow, a woman with pale skin and hair the color of flame. When he blinked, she was gone. Over time, the legend grew again, shaped and reshaped by those who needed her to mean something. To some, Lulu White became a symbol of defiance, a woman who had wrested power from the hands of a world that denied her the right to possess it. To others, she was a cautionary tale, proof that beauty and ambition end only in solitude. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between. She had been both victim and victor, sinner and saint, a creature of contradictions in a city built upon them. And yet, for all her wealth and ruin, what endured was not her scandal, but her sound. Jazz historians tracing the lineage of the music found her name again and again, not in the records, but in the recollections of those who had played for her. "She gave us the room," one of them had written in a letter found decades later. "She gave us the chance to be heard. Without her, we'd have played to the wind." That letter is now kept in a museum beside the few surviving photographs of the district. Visitors pause before the display, reading her name, listening to the faint recordings that play through hidden speakers. The music is scratchy, distant, imperfect, but still alive. A guide sometimes tells them in a low, conspiratorial voice, they say she walks the river at night. Most smile politely and move on. A few linger, eyes half closed, as if hoping to hear something in the static. Outside the museum, the modern city hums with life. Streetcars rumbling, neon signs flickering, the chatter of tourists blending with the rhythms of brass bands. But beneath that noise, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the other New Orleans, the one that sang before the lights came, before the buildings rose, when music was born from survival and longing. And somewhere within that hum, as soft as the whisper of a skirt brushing marble, her name remains, Lulu, not as a ghost, not quite, more as a refrain, an unfinished line in the melody of the city, returning when least expected, refusing to fade entirely. The river keeps her secrets, but it also keeps her story. It carries it outward, past the docks, past the gulf, into the vastness where water meets sky. Perhaps that is where she went in the end, not to death, but to motion, to the eternal rhythm she had always chased. And when the fog settles over New Orleans, heavy and fragrant, and the street lamps cast their tired glow upon the wet cobblestones, it is easy to believe that the faintest ripple on the river's surface is her doing, that somewhere out there the Diamond Queen still walks, her laughter folded into the sound of the tide, her song rising with the night. The fog still clung to the city when morning came, curling low over the roofs, softening even the sharp angles of the iron balconies. In that pale hour between night and day, New Orleans always seemed to remember itself, its sins, its songs, its silences. The streetcars began their slow rattle, carrying bakers, dock workers, musicians home from long nights. Somewhere near the river, a gull cried, its voice lost to the hum of the waking streets. The day began like every other, except for one small thing. The light that touched Basin Street lingered, as though reluctant to leave. The site where Mahogany Hall once stood was now a narrow office building, gray brick, unremarkable, its windows sealed tight against the damp air. Most who passed it did not look twice. But the ground beneath, that patch of earth that had felt the tread of so many lives, still seemed to hum faintly, like a note held too long after the song has ended. Those who worked in the building spoke of odd sounds, music faint as breath, the whisper of a woman's voice just at the edge of hearing. They would laugh it off, of course. This was New Orleans, after all. The ghosts here were not intrusions, but inhabitants. One of them, a janitor who cleaned the building late at night, told a story years later. He said that sometimes, when the corridors were empty and the lights dimmed, the smell of roses would drift through the air, mingled with something darker. Mahogany polish, perhaps, or brandy. "And there she is," he'd whisper to himself, not afraid but reverent, the lady of the house. Once, he claimed, he even heard footsteps descending a staircase that no longer existed. Soft ones, he said, like a woman in silk. The next morning, a faint damp footprint appeared on the marble near the entrance, though no rain had fallen that night. The story spread quietly, folded into the fabric of local legend. The newspapers never printed it, but the old musicians did in their own way. They spoke of her between sets, their words half laughter, half prayer. "Play it like Lulu's listening," they'd say, tapping their instruments. And when the horns lifted, something in the room would change. the air heavier, the rhythm smoother, the silence between notes deeper. Some swore that the very tone of jazz in New Orleans carried her imprint, that her ghost had become not a haunting, but a harmony, folded into the soul of the music itself. If the city forgot her face, it never forgot her sound. Across the years, her name found its way into songs, poems, even a play that never reached the stage. In one, she was imagined as a spectral hostess, greeting the dead as they crossed the river. In another, she was a prophetess of pleasure, teaching that sin, too, could be an art if done with grace. Yet no portrait, no lyric captured her truth. She had been too human for myth, too mythic for history. Her real legacy, quiet and invisible, lived on in the freedom of the music she had helped midwife, the wild pulse of jazz that refused to bow to rules or shame. In the 1970s, a historian named Al Rose wrote of her with affection and restraint, calling her both a criminal and a visionary. He traced her presence through city records and court archives, finding her name tucked between fines and property deeds, each one a small assertion of survival. Lulu White, he wrote, was the rhythm before the rhythm, the measure before the beat began. He was right in ways even he did not know. The city changed again and again, as it always would. Storyville was paved, erased, resurrected in memory, its ghosts commodified into postcards and walking tours. But for those who still listened closely, there were signs of her persistence. A broken mirror found in a warehouse bore faint etchings that resembled her initials. An antique shop on Royal Street displayed a tiara said to have belonged to a madam of the district, the stones dulled but still catching the light when the jazz bands played across the square. And on some late nights, when the city's laughter grew too loud, when its sins felt too eager, the wind from the river would shift suddenly, carrying the faintest scent of lilac and smoke, as if to remind it that elegance once had weight. In this way, she remained, less as a ghost and more as a pulse beneath the pavement, an undercurrent of dignity in a city that has always made beauty out of its ruins. The historians, the musicians, the dreamers who came after her, they all kept a piece of her story, reshaped it, retold it, gave it new names. Yet at its heart, it was always the same tale of a woman who built a palace from scorn, who made vice into art, who turned the small freedoms allowed her into something vast enough to echo beyond her time. Some say that every great city keeps one secret guardian, someone who loved it so fiercely that even death could not persuade them to leave. In Paris, it might be an artist. In Venice, a courtesan. In New Orleans, it was surely Lulu. The city owed her more than it ever admitted. She had preserved its most dangerous gift, the ability to feel joy even when the world condemned it. On certain mornings, when the mist still blankets the streets and the river glows faintly beneath the rising sun, the light falls in just such a way that the air above Basin Street turns the color of old champagne. The traffic pauses, the noise softens, and for a heartbeat, the world feels suspended between then and now. It is in that silence that she lives, neither entirely gone nor entirely remembered, her story still humming through the bricks, the brass, the river's slow song. Perhaps that is how immortality works, not as endless life, but as refusal to vanish completely. Not as worship, but as recognition. And if one evening you find yourself walking along Basin Street when the fog rolls in, and you hear laughter that seems to come from nowhere, don't be afraid. It is only the city speaking in her voice again, soft, amused, forgiving. You might catch a glimpse of her, too, standing in the half-light, a red gown brushing the ground, her jewels faintly aglow beneath the street lamps. She will not approach, only smile, as though she has been waiting for you to notice what she already knows, that beauty, once created, never truly dies. Then, as the music begins to rise from some distant corner, the low rumble of a trumpet, the sigh of a clarinet, the gentle thrum of a bass, you might feel the rhythm beneath your feet. That, too, is her doing. The city still dances because she once taught it how. And so the story closes where it began, with a woman standing at the edge of the river, her reflection shimmering in the water, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The fog thickens around her, the sound of music fades, and the light, warm, golden, eternal, touches her face one last time before it disappears into the dawn.